Tonight we travel to a country that has been telling its own story for over 5,000 years, a narrow ribbon of green threading through one of the driest deserts on Earth, a river that floods with such perfect ancient rhythm that an entire civilization built itself around the promise of its return. This is Egypt, a country older than most of the stories humanity tells about itself, and yet still, every single day, simply going on with the ordinary business of living. A land where the sacred and the everyday have always sat comfortably side by side, where a farmer's field and a 5,000-year-old temple might share the very same horizon. A land where the same sun that warmed the builders of the pyramids still rises over their tombs each morning, where farmers still work fields shaped by the same flood patterns their ancestors relied on 4,000 years before the Common Era began, where mosques call the faithful to prayer within sight of monuments built to gods whose names have been silent for 2,000 years. Egypt is not simply old, it is layered, the way sediment is layered, each era pressed beneath the next, each civilization building on top of the one before it, until the present day sits on top of a story so long that no single lifetime, no single dynasty, no single empire could tell all of it. Modern Egypt is home to over 110 million people, making it the most populous country in the Arab world and one of the most populous in Africa. And yet the overwhelming majority of that population lives on a tiny fraction of the country's land, crowded along the banks of a single river and its delta, because beyond that green corridor, there is almost nothing but sand. It is a nation defined by contrast, abundance and scarcity, ancient and modern, sacred and ordinary, all pressed together along the length of one extraordinary river. There is a phrase Egyptians sometimes use when describing their own homeland, al Dunya, the mother of the world. It is a bold claim, and yet, standing before the pyramids, or walking through the columned halls of Karnak, or watching the sun set behind a felucca's white sail on the Nile, it does not feel like an exaggeration so much as a simple statement of fact. Egypt gave the world some of its earliest writing, some of its earliest monumental architecture, some of its earliest recorded medicine, and one of its longest continuous civilizations, and it did all of this while quietly, patiently working out how to live alongside a single, extraordinary river. Few places on Earth ask so little of the imagination to feel the presence of deep time, and few places reward that feeling with such warmth, such hospitality, and such genuine, unhurried welcome. Whatever you carry into this journey tonight, curiosity, tiredness, simple restlessness, let it settle here for a while, beside the water, beneath a sky that has watched over this valley for longer than memory can properly reach, patient, unhurried, and endlessly, quietly generous. So settle in, let the noise of your evening fade, and let the Atlas carry you south, along the Nile, into a story older than most of what humanity has ever written down. To understand Egypt, you must first understand a single fact so important that the ancient Greek historian Herodotus built a phrase around it. He called Egypt the gift of the Nile. It was not poetry, it was simply true. The Nile is, by most measures, the longest river in the world, stretching more than 6,500 kilometers from its sources deep in East Africa to its mouth on the Mediterranean Sea. It gathers its waters from two great tributaries. The White Nile begins near the Great Lakes of Central Africa, flowing north through Uganda, South Sudan, and beyond. The Blue Nile rises in the highlands of Ethiopia, carrying with it the rich volcanic silt that would, for thousands of years, make Egyptian soil among the most fertile on Earth. The two rivers meet at Khartoum, in modern Sudan, and from there, the combined Nile flows north through the eastern Sahara, through what is now Egypt, and finally spreads into the wide marshy fan of the Nile Delta before emptying into the Mediterranean. For most of human history, the Nile in Egypt behaved with an almost eerie predictability. Each summer, rains far to the south, in the Ethiopian highlands, would swell the Blue Nile, and by late summer that surge of water would reach Egypt and cause the river to rise, spilling gently over its banks and spreading across the floodplain. This flood, called the inundation, deposited a fresh layer of dark, nutrient-rich silt across the fields each year, replenishing the soil without any need for artificial fertilizer. The ancient Egyptians called their own country Kemet, which means the black land, referring directly to this dark, fertile soil left behind by the flood. Beyond the reach of the water, the land was Desert, the red land, the desert, barren and lifeless, beginning abruptly at the edge of the floodplain, sometimes within a few dozen meters of lush green fields. This sharp boundary between black land and red land, between life and desolation, is something you can still see today, standing at the edge of a Nile-side village and looking out at the sand that begins almost at your feet. The predictability of the flood shaped everything about Egyptian civilization. Ancient Egyptians divided their year into 3 seasons based entirely on the Nile's behavior. Akhet was the season of the flood, when the waters rose and the fields lay submerged. Peret was the season of growth, when the floodwaters receded and farmers planted their crops in the newly enriched soil. Shemu was the season of the harvest, the dry months when crops were gathered before the cycle began again. This calendar, tied so intimately to the river, allowed Egyptians to develop sophisticated agriculture, predictable food surpluses, and, crucially, the free time and organizational capacity to build monuments, develop writing, and create one of the most enduring civilizations the world has known. The rhythm of the flood was interrupted only in the 20th century, with the construction of the Aswan High Dam, completed in 1970. The dam brought enormous benefits: reliable irrigation year-round, protection from catastrophic floods and devastating droughts, and a massive new source of hydroelectric power for a rapidly modernizing country. But it also ended, forever, the annual inundation that had shaped Egyptian agriculture and Egyptian identity for over 5,000 years. The silt that once fertilized the fields each year now settles instead at the bottom of Lake Nasser, the vast reservoir created behind the dam, and Egyptian farmers today rely on chemical fertilizers to replace what the river used to give freely. It is one of the great trade-offs of modern development: control and safety purchased at the cost of an ancient elemental rhythm that had defined the country since before its history was written. Beyond the narrow strip of the Nile Valley and its delta, Egypt is almost entirely desert. The Western Desert, part of the Great Sahara, stretches for hundreds of kilometers, a landscape of sand seas, rocky plateaus, and a scattering of oases where underground water reaches the surface. The Great Sand Sea, along the border with Libya, contains dunes that can rise over 100 meters high, shifting slowly across the landscape in patterns shaped by the wind. The Eastern Desert, between the Nile and the Red Sea, is a starker, more mountainous terrain, cut by dry riverbeds called wadis that fill briefly and violently during the rare desert rains. And in the far south of this eastern desert region, ancient gold mines and quarries once supplied the pharaohs with the precious materials that filled their tombs. Scattered through the western desert are a handful of oases, isolated pockets of life sustained by underground aquifers that reach the surface in springs and wells. Siwa, the most remote of these, sits near the Libyan border, so far from the Nile Valley that it developed its own distinct culture, its own language, a Berber dialect unrelated to Arabic, and its own traditions, largely independent of the rhythms of the rest of Egypt. In ancient times, Siwa was home to a famous oracle dedicated to the god Amun, so renowned that Alexander the Great made a difficult journey across the desert specifically to consult it, seeking confirmation of his divine parentage. Today, Siwa remains one of the most tranquil and least visited corners of Egypt, its mud brick fortress crumbling gently under the desert sun, its palm groves watered by springs that have flowed, without pause, for thousands of years. Not far away lies the White Desert, a landscape unlike anywhere else in Egypt, where wind and sand have carved chalk-white rock formations into surreal, almost sculptural shapes, mushrooms, camels, and figures that seem to shift with the changing light. Camping beneath the stars in the White Desert, surrounded by these pale, ghostly formations, with no artificial light for many kilometers in any direction, is one of Egypt's quietest and most otherworldly experiences. Where the Nile finally reaches the Mediterranean, it spreads into the delta, a broad, fertile fan of land crisscrossed by distributary channels, canals, and some of the most intensively farmed land on the planet. The delta is far wider than the narrow Nile Valley to the south, and it holds a substantial share of Egypt's entire population, its fields producing cotton, rice, wheat, and vegetables in a landscape so thoroughly cultivated that from the air it looks almost like a single continuous garden, stretching from Cairo to the sea. This region has always been Egypt's breadbasket, and in ancient times it was also the country's gateway to the wider Mediterranean world, the place where Egyptian civilization met and traded with Greeks, Phoenicians, and the many other peoples who sailed those waters. Long before Alexandria rose to prominence, the delta's Mediterranean coast hosted a succession of important trading ports, connecting Egypt to civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean basin. The ancient city of Naucratis, established by Greek traders with Egyptian permission during the 7th century BCE, functioned as a dedicated trading colony where Greek merchants could exchange olive oil, wine, and silver for Egyptian grain, papyrus, and linen, all under carefully regulated terms that protected Egyptian sovereignty while still permitting the commercial exchange both parties clearly desired. This arrangement offers an interesting counterpoint to the later, far more one-sided colonial relationships Egypt would eventually experience with European powers, demonstrating that ancient Egyptians were entirely capable of engaging with foreign trading partners on their own terms, when their political and military position allowed it. Further east along the same coastline, the ancient city of Pelusium guarded the traditional land route between Egypt and the Levant, serving as a critical military and commercial gateway for millennia, the site of numerous historically significant battles as successive empires, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, Roman, and eventually Arab, sought to control this strategic choke point connecting Africa and Asia. Much of Pelusium now lies buried beneath drifting coastal sand and silt deposited by the Nile's eastern distributary channels, its walls and buildings gradually swallowed by the same river system that once made the city so commercially vital. A quiet reminder that even Egypt's own landscape has never stopped slowly reshaping itself, burying some chapters of the country's history even as it continues to sustain the ongoing chapters still being written today. The climate along the Nile is famously dry and famously consistent. Cairo receives, on average, only a handful of days of measurable rainfall each year, and much of Upper Egypt, the southern part of the country, confusingly named because the Nile flows north, so upper refers to elevation, sees virtually no rain at all in a typical year. Summers are intensely hot, with daytime temperatures in southern cities like Aswan regularly exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. Winters are mild and pleasant along the Nile itself, though desert nights, even in summer, can turn surprisingly cold once the sun goes down, the dry air offering no insulation once the heat of the day disperses into the clear desert sky. This combination of intense heat, minimal rainfall, and an utterly reliable river has produced one of the most stable agricultural environments in human history, and it is no coincidence that one of humanity's first and longest-lasting civilizations arose precisely here, along this narrow, predictable, endlessly generous river, in the middle of one of the most unforgiving deserts on Earth. To the east of the Nile Valley lies another Egypt entirely, one defined not by the river but by the sea. The Red Sea coast stretches for hundreds of kilometers, its warm, exceptionally clear waters home to some of the most pristine coral reefs anywhere in the world, a fact that has made towns like Hurghada and Sharm el-Sheikh into major international diving and snorkeling destinations in recent decades. Beneath the surface, an extraordinary variety of marine life thrives: parrotfish, clownfish, moray eels, sea turtles, and, in deeper waters, dolphins and occasionally whale sharks, gliding through reef systems that have developed over thousands of years in water so clear that visibility can extend 30 meters or more on a calm day. Coral gardens along protected stretches of this coastline, including the marine sanctuary of Ras Mohammed at the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, rank among the most biodiverse and carefully preserved reef ecosystems in the entire Red Sea, drawing marine researchers and recreational divers alike to witness an underwater world that stands in striking, almost surreal contrast to the arid desert mountains rising immediately behind the shoreline. Further north, where the Sinai Peninsula juts out to separate the Gulf of Suez from the Gulf of Aqaba, the landscape turns dramatically mountainous, rising to jagged granite peaks that seem to belong to an entirely different country than the flat, fertile Nile Valley to the west. Mount Sinai itself, rising to over 2,200 meters, holds deep significance across all three Abrahamic faiths as the traditional site where Moses received the Ten Commandments, and to this day, pilgrims and travelers climb through the night to reach its summit before dawn, waiting in the cold mountain air for the sunrise to spread slowly across the surrounding desert peaks, a moment many describe as genuinely transcendent regardless of their own personal faith. At the base of the mountain sits St. Catherine's Monastery, founded in the 6th century CE, and still home to an active community of Orthodox monks, making it one of the oldest continuously functioning monasteries in the entire world. Its library, holding one of the most significant collections of ancient manuscripts outside the Vatican, second in scholarly importance perhaps only to the Vatican's own collection. Life along the Nile itself has always depended on more than agriculture alone. Fishing remains an important livelihood for many communities along the river, using techniques and boat designs that, in their essential form, have changed relatively little over centuries, even as engine-powered vessels have gradually supplemented or replaced the traditional wooden feluccas and smaller rowing boats once universal along the waterway. Water buffalo, introduced to Egypt many centuries ago, remain a common sight wading in shallow irrigation canals or resting in the cooler mud along the riverbank, providing milk, labor, and, eventually, meat to rural households in a relationship between animal and farmer that has persisted with only modest change since well before the pharaonic era ended. The riverbanks themselves teem with birdlife throughout the year, but especially during the great seasonal migrations, when millions of birds pass along the Nile corridor as a natural flyway connecting breeding grounds in Europe and northern Asia with wintering grounds in sub-Saharan Africa. Herons, egrets, kingfishers, and countless smaller songbirds populate the reeds and irrigated fields, while raptors circle high above the desert cliffs bordering the valley, and the sight of white egrets standing motionless in a green rice paddy, waiting patiently for fish or frogs to come within striking distance, remains one of the quietly beautiful, endlessly repeated images of daily Nile life. Long before there were pharaohs, before there were pyramids, before there was writing, there were farmers along the Nile, gradually learning to work in harmony with the river's rhythm. By around 5000 BCE, small farming communities had taken root along the Nile Valley, cultivating wheat and barley, raising cattle, and slowly developing the social organization that intensive agriculture demands. Over the following centuries, these communities grew more complex, forming two distinct cultural and political zones. Lower Egypt occupied the broad marshy delta in the north. Upper Egypt stretched along the narrower valley to the south. Each region developed its own traditions, its own symbols, and eventually its own rulers. Around 3100 BCE, according to Egyptian tradition, a king remembered as Nama, sometimes identified with a ruler called Menes in later king lists, united Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. The event is commemorated on an extraordinary carved slate object known as the Nama palette, which shows the king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other, a visual declaration of unification that would echo through Egyptian royal iconography for the next 3,000 years. From this unification onward, Egyptian kings would carry the title Lord of the Two Lands, and the double crown, combining the white and the red, would remain a symbol of legitimate rule for the rest of pharaonic history. This moment of unification marks the traditional beginning of what historians call dynastic Egypt, a period of pharaonic rule that would last, with interruptions, for close to 3,000 years, a span of time so long that it is genuinely difficult for the modern mind to hold in perspective. Consider this: the time separating the construction of the earliest pyramids from the reign of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, is longer than the time separating Cleopatra from us today. Ancient Egypt was ancient even to itself, a civilization so long-lived that its own citizens in its final centuries looked back on its earliest monuments with the same sense of awe and distance that we ourselves feel today. Long before Nama united the two lands, the people living along the Nile had already developed remarkably sophisticated cultures, evidence of which survives in scattered pre-dynastic sites throughout Upper Egypt. At a site called Nekin, known to the Greeks as Hierakonpolis, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a substantial early settlement dating back over 6,000 years, including elaborate tombs, evidence of long-distance trade, and some of the earliest known examples of Egyptian art and symbolism, suggesting that many of the visual and religious concepts that would define pharaonic civilization for the next 3,000 years were already taking shape well before any single ruler claimed authority over the entire Nile Valley. Rock art carved into desert cliffs bordering the Nile, some of it predating written history entirely, depicts boats, cattle, hunting scenes, and figures that some scholars interpret as early representations of chieftains or proto-kings, suggesting that concepts of leadership, ritual, and organized society were developing gradually over many centuries rather than emerging suddenly at the moment of unification. This gradual development makes sense when you consider what unification actually required: a shared understanding of kingship, a common set of religious and artistic conventions, and enough administrative sophistication to manage taxation and labor across a territory stretching hundreds of kilometers along a single river, none of which could plausibly have been invented overnight by a single conquering king, however celebrated. Abydos in Upper Egypt holds a special place in the story of early Egyptian kingship, serving as the burial ground for many of the earliest dynastic rulers and later becoming one of the most sacred sites in the entire Egyptian religious landscape. Believed to be the location where the god Osiris's head was buried after his murder and dismemberment by his brother Set. For thousands of years afterward, Egyptians of every social class sought to be buried at Abydos, or at least to erect a memorial stone there, believing that proximity to this sacred site would grant them a share in Osiris's own resurrection and eternal life. And the site remained an important place of pilgrimage throughout the entire span of pharaonic history, right up until the very end of ancient Egyptian religious practice. The early dynasties, sometimes called the Archaic period, established the fundamental institutions that would define Egyptian civilization for millennia: a centralized monarchy considered divine or semi-divine, a system of writing using hieroglyphic script, a bureaucracy capable of managing large-scale irrigation and taxation, and an artistic and religious vocabulary that would remain remarkably consistent for thousands of years. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, one of the earliest writing systems in human history, developed alongside, and possibly in dialogue with, the cuneiform script emerging in Mesopotamia at roughly the same time. Unlike cuneiform, hieroglyphs combined phonetic signs representing sounds with logographic signs representing whole words or ideas, creating a system that was visually stunning but required years of specialized training to master. For most of Egyptian history, literacy was the preserve of a small class of scribes who occupied a position of considerable prestige and who were responsible for everything from royal inscriptions to tax records to medical texts. The unification of Egypt and the development of centralized kingship set the stage for one of the most remarkable periods in the country's long history, the Old Kingdom, often called the Age of the Pyramids, when Egyptian rulers would undertake construction projects so ambitious that they remain, 4,500 years later, among the most impressive structures ever built by human hands. Around 2650 BCE, a king named Djoser commissioned his architect, a brilliant polymath named Imhotep, to design his tomb. What Imhotep produced was revolutionary: a step pyramid at Saqqara, rising in 6 diminishing tiers, the first large-scale monument in the world built entirely of cut stone. Imhotep would later be deified, one of the very few non-royal Egyptians ever to achieve that honor, remembered for millennia as a genius of architecture, medicine, and wisdom. The step pyramid opened the door to a burst of architectural experimentation, and within a century, Egyptian builders had progressed from stepped structures to true smooth-sided pyramids. The most famous of these, and arguably the most famous structure ever built by human beings, is the Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed for the pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE. When completed, the Great Pyramid stood at approximately 146 meters tall, making it the tallest man-made structure on Earth, a record it would hold for nearly 4,000 years, until the completion of Lincoln Cathedral in England in the 14th century. The scale of the Great Pyramid is difficult to comprehend even when standing directly beside it. It contains an estimated 2.3 million blocks of stone, most weighing between 2.5 and 15 tons, with some of the largest blocks, used in the internal chambers, weighing as much as 80 tons. The precision of its construction remains a subject of genuine scholarly fascination. Its base is level to within a few centimeters across its entire 230-meter length, and its four sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that modern surveyors find remarkable, especially considering this was accomplished without the benefit of a magnetic compass. How exactly the ancient Egyptians moved and positioned these enormous blocks remains a subject of ongoing research and occasional lively debate. The most widely accepted theories involve a combination of ramps, sledges, and levers, with teams of laborers dragging stones up graduated inclines, aided by water poured onto the sand ahead of the sledges to reduce friction, a technique actually depicted in an ancient Egyptian tomb painting showing workers moving a colossal statue. Far from being built by slaves, as popular imagination long assumed, archaeological evidence from a workers' town near Giza suggests the pyramids were constructed largely by a rotating labor force of Egyptian farmers conscripted during the months when the Nile's flood made fieldwork impossible, fed on a diet substantial enough to include regular meat, and organized into named work gangs with a genuine sense of pride and identity, some of them leaving behind graffiti boasting of their team's contributions. Alongside Khufu's pyramid stand two others, built for his son Khafre and his grandson Menkaure, along with a scattering of smaller pyramids for queens and satellite structures for solar barges, ceremonial boats meant to carry the pharaoh's spirit across the sky in the company of the sun god. One such boat, remarkably preserved, was discovered disassembled in a pit beside the Great Pyramid in 1954 and has since been painstakingly reconstructed, offering a rare glimpse of ancient Egyptian shipbuilding at a level of craftsmanship that still impresses naval historians today. Guarding the Giza plateau is the Great Sphinx, a colossal limestone statue with the body of a lion and, most scholars believe, the face of Khafre, carved directly from the bedrock left over after quarrying stone for the surrounding pyramids. The Sphinx has stood, weathered by wind and buried at times up to its shoulders in drifting desert sand, for roughly 4,500 years, its expression enigmatic, its original nose lost to a combination of natural erosion and, according to some accounts, deliberate damage inflicted centuries later. Standing before it, at the scale it actually occupies rather than the compressed scale of photographs, visitors often describe a genuine sense of vertigo, a monument so old, so large, and so strange that it seems to belong to a different order of time altogether. The Old Kingdom, the era of pyramid building, lasted roughly 500 years, from around 2686 to 2181 BCE, and it represented a period of extraordinary centralized power, with the pharaoh regarded as a living god, the intermediary between the divine and human worlds, responsible for maintaining the cosmic order the Egyptians called Ma'at, a concept encompassing truth, balance, justice, and the correct functioning of the universe itself. But this centralized power eventually frayed. Toward the end of the Old Kingdom, a combination of factors, including a series of unusually low Nile floods, likely tied to broader climatic shifts across the region, along with the growing independence and wealth of provincial governors, weakened central authority, and Egypt slid into a period of political fragmentation known as the First Intermediate Period, when regional rulers competed for power and the grand unity of the Pyramid Age gave way to roughly a century and a half of division and instability. Alongside the great royal monuments, the Old Kingdom produced an enormous body of art depicting the daily lives of ordinary Egyptians, carved and painted onto the walls of the tombs of officials, nobles, and priests who wished to ensure their own comfortable afterlife by surrounding themselves, in death, with vivid scenes of the world they had enjoyed in life. These tomb paintings show farmers plowing fields behind oxen, fishermen hauling in nets bursting with Nile fish, bakers kneading dough, brewers preparing beer, musicians playing harps and flutes at banquets, and children playing games in scenes so full of specific, observed detail that they remain one of our richest sources of information about ordinary ancient Egyptian life, arguably more valuable to historians in some respects than the grander religious and royal texts that have survived from the same period. The famous seated statue of the scribe Kai and countless similar sculptures of officials from this era display a striking realism and individuality that stands in interesting contrast to the more formal, idealized style typically used to depict pharaohs themselves, suggesting that Old Kingdom artists possessed considerable technical skill and observational sensitivity that they deployed differently depending on whether they were representing the eternal, idealized authority of kingship or the more individual, personal identity of a specific administrator or priest who wished to be remembered, quite literally, as himself. Giza's step pyramid complex at Saqqara, beyond the pyramid itself, included an extraordinary array of surrounding structures that reveal just how sophisticated Imhotep's original architectural vision truly was. The complex featured dummy buildings, solid stone structures built to resemble functional architecture but never intended to be entered, designed to provide Giza's spirit with everything a royal jubilee festival would require in the afterlife, including a symbolic running course where the king's spirit could eternally reenact the ritual sprint that ancient Egyptian kings performed to demonstrate their continued physical vitality and fitness to rule. This attention to recreating an entire ceremonial landscape in stone, rather than simply constructing a single burial monument, illustrates just how thoroughly ancient Egyptian religious thought extended the concerns of earthly kingship into the imagined eternal world beyond death, treating the afterlife not as a vague abstraction but as a fully realized continuation of royal life, requiring its own palaces, courtyards, and ceremonial spaces, all rendered permanently in stone rather than the perishable mud brick and wood of the world of the living. The discovery, beginning in the 1990s, of a substantial workers' settlement just south of the Giza pyramids has transformed our understanding of who actually built these monuments and how they lived while doing so. Archaeologists uncovered bakeries capable of producing bread on an industrial scale, breweries for producing the beer that formed a staple part of the ancient Egyptian diet, and evidence of a rotating workforce housed in barracks-style dormitories, supplied with meat, including significant quantities of cattle, sheep, and goat, at a rate suggesting a well-organized state apparatus dedicated to feeding and caring for its workforce, rather than the popular Hollywood image of an enslaved population toiling under the whip. Cemeteries adjacent to the workers' settlement contain the burials of the laborers themselves, some showing evidence of healed bone fractures that had been carefully set and treated, indicating a degree of medical care extended even to ordinary workers, and some tombs bear inscriptions identifying the deceased by the name of their work gang, with titles like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkaure, team names that suggest genuine camaraderie, competitive pride, and even humor among the men who spent months or years of their lives hauling stone across the desert to build monuments for their king. Before Egyptian builders achieved the smooth, perfectly proportioned form of the Great Pyramid, they experimented, and occasionally failed, in ways that are still visible today at the royal necropolis of Dahshur south of Saqqara. The bent pyramid, built for the pharaoh Sneferu, Khufu's father, changes angle partway up its structure, the lower portion rising at a steep 54 degrees before abruptly shifting to a shallower 43 degrees near the top, a change most Egyptologists believe was a hasty engineering correction made after cracks appeared in the structure, threatening collapse. Sneferu, apparently undeterred, went on to build the Red Pyramid nearby, using the shallower angle from the very base, producing what most scholars consider the first successful true pyramid in Egyptian history, meaning that Sneferu, rather than his more famous son Khufu, may deserve credit as the pharaoh who genuinely perfected pyramid construction, even though his son's later, larger monument would become the far more famous of the two. No aspect of ancient Egyptian civilization has captured the modern imagination quite like its beliefs about death and the afterlife, and understanding those beliefs requires first, understanding the vast and intricate world of Egyptian religion. The ancient Egyptians worshipped an enormous pantheon of gods, numbering in the hundreds, many of them associated with specific towns, specific aspects of nature, or specific functions within the cosmic order. Ra, the sun god, sailed across the sky each day in his solar bark and journeyed through the perilous underworld each night, battling the serpent of chaos, Apophis, before being reborn at dawn. Osiris, murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set, was reassembled and revived by his devoted wife Isis, becoming the god of the afterlife and resurrection, and his story, death, restoration, and eternal life, became the template for how ordinary Egyptians hoped their own deaths might unfold. Horus, the falcon-headed son of Isis and Osiris, avenged his father and became associated with living kingship, so that every pharaoh, while alive, was considered an embodiment of Horus, and upon death was believed to become Osiris himself. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, presided over mummification and guided the dead through the underworld. Thoth, depicted with the head of an ibis, was the god of writing, wisdom, and knowledge, credited with inventing hieroglyphs themselves. And Ma'at, often personified as a goddess wearing a single ostrich feather, represented the truth and balance that underpinned the entire Egyptian understanding of a well-ordered universe. Central to Egyptian religious life was an elaborate and sincerely held belief in the afterlife, one dramatically different from the vague, shadowy underworld imagined by many other ancient cultures. For the Egyptians, death was not an ending but a transition, and the afterlife could be as rich and vivid as earthly existence, provided certain conditions were met. The process began with mummification, a practice developed over centuries into a sophisticated art. Embalmers removed the internal organs, with the notable exception of the heart, believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, which was left in place for judgment, and preserved them separately in canopic jars, each guarded by one of the four sons of Horus. The body itself was dried using natron, a naturally occurring salt compound, over a period of roughly 40 days, then wrapped in hundreds of meters of linen bandages with protective amulets tucked between the layers, before being placed in a series of nested coffins, sometimes within an outer stone sarcophagus. The most dramatic moment in the Egyptian vision of the afterlife was the weighing of the heart, a scene depicted repeatedly in tomb paintings and in the collection of spells known as the Book of the Dead. In this ceremony held in the Hall of Two Truths, the deceased's heart was placed on one side of a great scale, balanced against the feather of Ma'at on the other. If the heart was lighter than the feather, meaning the person had lived a just and truthful life, the deceased was granted passage into the eternal afterlife, the field of reeds, imagined as an idealized version of the Nile Valley, abundant and peaceful. If the heart was heavier, weighed down by wrongdoing, it would be devoured by a monstrous creature called Ammit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, and the deceased would cease to exist entirely, a fate the Egyptians considered far worse than any punishment in a fiery underworld, because it meant total, permanent erasure. To support the deceased in this afterlife, tombs were furnished with everything a person might need: food, furniture, clothing, jewelry, and small figurines called shaptis, meant to serve as magical laborers who would perform any manual work required of the deceased in the fields of the afterlife, so that the person themselves could enjoy eternal leisure. The most famous tomb discovery in the history of archaeology belongs to a relatively minor pharaoh named Tutankhamun, who died around 1323 BCE at approximately 18 or 19 years of age, likely from a combination of a severe leg fracture, malaria, and possible genetic complications resulting from his parents being close relatives. Because he died young and was quickly succeeded, and because his memory was later suppressed by subsequent rulers who wished to erase the religious upheavals of his father's reign, Tutankhamun's tomb was small, hastily prepared, and, crucially, largely overlooked by the tomb robbers who plundered nearly every other royal burial in the Valley of the Kings. When the British archaeologist Howard Carter discovered the tomb's entrance in November 1922, after years of largely fruitless searching funded by his patron Lord Carnarvon, he peered through a small hole into the antechamber and, when asked by Carnarvon what he could see, famously replied, Yes, wonderful things. The tomb contained over 5,000 objects, including the now iconic solid gold funerary mask, layers of nested coffins, chariots, weapons, jewelry, furniture, and countless other treasures, offering the first largely intact glimpse of the wealth that accompanied even a minor pharaoh into the afterlife, and prompting the tantalizing, unanswerable question of what treasures must have accompanied the great pharaohs whose tombs were stripped bare by robbers millennia ago. The Valley of the Kings, on the west bank of the Nile opposite the city of Luxor, became the primary royal burial ground during the New Kingdom period, chosen partly for its remote, defensible location and partly because a nearby pyramid-shaped peak, Al-Qarn, may have been seen as a natural echo of the pyramids that had by then become impractical to build and impossible to protect from robbery. More than 60 tombs have been identified in the valley, ranging from small, simple pits to elaborate multi-chambered complexes decorated with vivid, meticulously preserved paintings depicting the pharaoh's journey through the underworld, guided by spells and imagery intended to ensure safe passage into eternal life. While tombs and the afterlife often dominate popular imagination about ancient Egyptian religion, temples devoted to the living gods played an equally central role in Egyptian life, though in a manner quite different from modern religious worship. Ordinary Egyptians rarely entered the innermost sanctuaries of major temples like Karnak, which were considered the literal earthly homes of the gods, tended daily by priests who performed rituals of washing, dressing, and feeding the divine statues housed within, treating them, in a very real sense, as living beings requiring constant care. Public access was generally limited to the outer courtyards, and it was primarily during great religious festivals, when statues of the gods were paraded through the streets in ornate processional barks carried on the shoulders of priests, that ordinary people had any direct visual encounter with the divine images they otherwise worshipped from a respectful distance. The temple complex at Karnak, expanded and embellished by successive pharaohs over nearly 2,000 years, eventually grew into the largest religious building complex ever constructed anywhere in the ancient world. Its great hypostyle hall alone containing 134 massive stone columns, some rising over 20 meters high and wide enough that several adults linking arms could not encircle their base, the whole space designed to overwhelm visitors with a sense of divine scale entirely beyond ordinary human proportion. Walking through this forest of towering columns today, even in their weathered and partially ruined state, remains one of the most genuinely awe-inspiring experiences available anywhere in the ancient world. The sheer density and height of the stonework creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that change dramatically as the sun moves across the sky throughout the day. For ordinary Egyptians, far removed from the grand state temples, religious life took a more intimate, household-centered form. Small shrines dedicated to protective household deities, particularly the dwarf god Bes, associated with protection of the home and safe childbirth, and the hippopotamus goddess Taweret, similarly associated with fertility and protection during pregnancy, were common features of ordinary Egyptian homes, and amulets depicting these deities have been found in vast numbers throughout Egyptian archaeological sites, worn by people of every social class seeking divine protection in their daily lives. Magic and religion were not clearly separated categories in ancient Egyptian thought, and spells, charms, and protective rituals formed an unremarkable, everyday part of life, invoked for everything from healing illness to ensuring safe childbirth to protecting travelers on journeys along the sometimes dangerous roads bordering the cultivated valley. Following the political fragmentation of the First Intermediate Period, Egypt was gradually reunified around 2055 BCE by a Theban ruler named Mentuhotep II, ushering in the era historians call the Middle Kingdom, a period often regarded by Egyptologists as something of a golden age for Egyptian literature, art, and administrative sophistication, even if its royal monuments never again approached the sheer scale of the Great Giza pyramids. Middle Kingdom pharaohs, perhaps chastened by witnessing how quickly the grandeur of the Old Kingdom had collapsed into disorder, generally pursued a more pragmatic and less monumentally extravagant style of rule, focusing considerable energy on internal administration, expanding agricultural land through irrigation projects in the Fayum region southwest of modern Cairo, and securing Egypt's borders through military campaigns into Nubia to the south, where a series of massive mud brick fortresses were constructed along the Nile to control trade and defend against incursions. This period produced some of the finest literature in the ancient Egyptian language, including the story of Sinuhe, an account of a court official who fled Egypt following the death of a pharaoh and lived for years in exile among Semitic-speaking peoples in the Levant, before eventually being permitted to return home in his old age, a narrative so beautifully crafted and psychologically nuanced that it was copied and studied by Egyptian scribes for well over 1,000 years after its composition, functioning as something like a classic novel within Egyptian literary education. Middle Kingdom texts also include a rich body of wisdom literature, offering practical and philosophical guidance on proper conduct, and pessimistic literature reflecting, likely, genuine cultural memory of the chaos of the First Intermediate Period, including works that questioned the meaning of life and the value of traditional burial customs with a frankness that some modern readers find startlingly familiar. Middle Kingdom royal jewelry and metalwork, recovered from several relatively intact tombs, display a level of craftsmanship and artistic sophistication that many Egyptologists consider unsurpassed in any other period of Egyptian history, with intricate gold pectorals inlaid with semi-precious stones in complex, symbolically rich designs that required extraordinary technical skill to produce. The Middle Kingdom eventually gave way, around 1650 BCE, to a second period of fragmentation known as the Second Intermediate Period, during which a group of foreign rulers called the Hyksos, likely originating from the Levant, gained control over portions of northern Egypt, introducing new technologies including the horse-drawn chariot and composite bow that would later prove essential to Egyptian military success once native Theban rulers eventually expelled the Hyksos and reunified the country, launching the new kingdom and its age of empire that we will now explore in greater detail. Beyond religion, monuments, and dynastic politics, ancient Egypt made genuine and lasting contributions to human knowledge that are sometimes overshadowed by the country's more famous archaeological treasures. Egyptian medicine, as documented in surviving papyri such as the Edwin Smith papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE but likely copying much older material, reveals a surprisingly rational, observation-based approach to treating injuries, describing in careful, methodical detail a series of case studies covering everything from head wounds to spinal injuries, including honest acknowledgement of conditions the ancient physician recognized as untreatable, a level of clinical honesty that would not have been out of place in a modern medical textbook. Egyptian physicians developed genuine surgical techniques, splinted broken bones, prescribed medicines derived from an extensive pharmacopoeia of plants and minerals, and performed what appear to have been successful trepanation procedures, drilling small holes into the skull to relieve pressure from head injuries, with skeletal evidence showing that some patients survived this procedure and lived for years afterward, their skull bone visibly healing around the surgical opening. At the same time, Egyptian medicine remained thoroughly intertwined with religious and magical practice, and treatments often combined practical remedies with recited spells and protective amulets, reflecting a worldview in which physical illness and spiritual or magical causation were not considered separate categories requiring separate solutions. Egyptian achievements in mathematics, while less abstractly theoretical than those of later Greek mathematicians, were remarkably practical and sophisticated, essential for tasks including the precise surveying required to re-establish field boundaries after each year's Nile flood erased them, the architectural calculations underlying pyramid construction, and the administrative arithmetic needed to manage taxation and grain storage across the entire kingdom. The Egyptian officials responsible for this annual land re-surveying, known to the Greeks as rope stretchers for the knotted cords they used to measure distances and establish right angles, developed practical geometric techniques that some historians believe directly influenced the later, more theoretical geometric traditions the Greeks would eventually develop and formalize centuries afterward, including, quite possibly, the very Pythagorean relationships that Greek mathematicians would later prove with abstract rigor but that Egyptian surveyors had already been applying successfully. through practical trial and accumulated experience, for a very long time before any Greek geometer ever wrote a formal proof. Surviving mathematical papyri, including the Rhine mathematical papyrus, demonstrate Egyptian proficiency with fractions, geometry, and even early approximations of pi, achieved through careful practical measurement rather than abstract theoretical derivation. Perhaps the most enduring Egyptian scientific achievement is the calendar itself. Ancient Egyptians developed a solar calendar of 365 days, divided into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 additional days added at the year's end, based on careful astronomical observation of the star Sirius, whose annual heliacal rising, its first visible appearance above the eastern horizon just before dawn, after a period of invisibility, closely coincided with the beginning of the Nile flood, allowing Egyptian priests to predict the flood's arrival with impressive accuracy. This basic calendar structure, refined over centuries, profoundly influenced the later Julian calendar introduced by Julius Caesar following his own time in Egypt, and through it ultimately shaped the Gregorian calendar that much of the modern world still uses today, meaning that the basic rhythm of our own contemporary year, months of roughly 30 days each, owes a genuine and direct debt to careful astronomical observations made by Egyptian priests watching the night sky above the Nile Valley many thousands of years ago. Egyptian astronomical knowledge extended well beyond the calendar into the careful, deliberate alignment of temples and monuments with specific celestial events. Several major temples, including portions of the complex at Karnak, appear to have been oriented with considerable precision toward the sunrise on the summer solstice, allowing sunlight to penetrate deep into the temple's innermost chambers on this single, symbolically significant day of the year. A demonstration of applied astronomical knowledge requiring sustained, careful observation across many years to achieve such consistent architectural precision. This same tradition of celestial alignment, refined over centuries of temple construction, ultimately found its most famous expression in Ramesses II's temple at Abu Simbel, discussed earlier, where the biannual illumination of the inner sanctuary stands as perhaps the most celebrated single example of ancient Egyptian architectural and astronomical sophistication working in perfect, deliberate harmony. After the fragmentation of the first intermediate period, and a second period of division later known as the Second Intermediate Period, Egypt entered its most powerful and prosperous era, the New Kingdom, lasting roughly from 1550 to 1070 BCE, a time when Egyptian influence extended further beyond its borders than at any other point in its ancient history. One of the most remarkable rulers of this period was not a king in the traditional sense, but a queen who ruled as pharaoh in her own right, Hatshepsut, who came to power around 1478 BCE, first as regent for her young stepson and later as full pharaoh, presided over roughly 2 decades of peace and prosperity, commissioning grand building projects, including her spectacular mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, and sponsoring a famous trading expedition to the land of Punt, likely located along the Red Sea coast of modern Eritrea or Somalia, which returned laden with incense, exotic animals, and living myrrh trees. The Punt expedition is recorded in exceptional pictorial detail on the walls of Hatshepsut's mortuary temple, depicting Egyptian ships arriving at Punt's shore, their crews being greeted by the rulers of Punt, described as living in distinctive stilt houses surrounded by incense trees, and the loading of Egyptian vessels with an extraordinary cargo including frankincense and myrrh resin, ebony, ivory, gold, exotic animals including baboons and a giraffe, and, in an especially prized botanical achievement, entire living myrrh trees, their root balls carefully wrapped for the long sea voyage back to Egypt, to be replanted in the courtyards of Hatshepsut's own temple. This level of detailed visual documentation of a specific trading voyage is unusual even by ancient Egyptian standards, suggesting that Hatshepsut placed particular political importance on publicizing this expedition, likely as a means of demonstrating her capability and legitimacy as a ruler through successful foreign engagement and the acquisition of exotic wealth, precisely the kind of achievement expected of a strong pharaoh regardless of gender. To legitimize her unconventional rule in a strongly patriarchal society, Hatshepsut was often depicted in official art wearing the false beard and regalia traditionally associated with male pharaohs, a striking visual assertion of her authority. After her death, her successor Thutmose III, possibly out of political necessity, possibly out of personal resentment, ordered many of her monuments defaced and her name removed from official king lists, an act of historical erasure so thorough that Hatshepsut's remarkable reign was largely forgotten until Egyptologists pieced her story back together from the fragments that survived. Thutmose III himself became one of ancient Egypt's most successful military leaders, leading numerous campaigns into the Levant and expanding Egyptian influence deep into what is now Syria, earning, from some modern historians, the nickname the Napoleon of Egypt. Perhaps no pharaoh looms larger in popular memory than Ramesses II, who ruled for an astonishing 66 years, from around 1279 to 1213 BCE, and who used that extraordinarily long reign to construct more monuments than any other ruler in Egyptian history. His temple complex at Abu Simbel, carved directly into a sandstone cliff in the far south of Egypt, features 4 colossal seated statues of the pharaoh, each over 20 meters tall, positioned so precisely that twice a year, on dates believed to correspond to Ramesses' birthday and coronation, the rising sun penetrates deep into the temple's interior to illuminate the statues of the gods seated in its innermost sanctuary. When the Aswan High Dam threatened to submerge Abu Simbel beneath the rising waters of Lake Nasser in the 1960s, an extraordinary international engineering effort, coordinated by UNESCO, cut the entire temple complex into more than 1,000 blocks and reassembled it, piece by piece, on higher ground nearby, one of the most remarkable feats of archaeological preservation in modern history, and a testament to how deeply the world still values what Ramesses built more than 3,000 years earlier. Alongside his own great temple at Abu Simbel, Ramesses II built a smaller, adjacent temple dedicated to his beloved principal wife, Nefertari, its facade featuring 6 colossal statues, 3 representing Ramesses and 3 representing Nefertari herself, each figure carved at the same towering scale, an arrangement virtually unprecedented in Egyptian royal art, where queens were traditionally depicted at a noticeably smaller scale than their pharaoh husbands, standing modestly beside or below them. An inscription at the temple entrance declares that it was built for Nefertari, for whom the sun shines. Language of striking personal devotion rare in the formal, often impersonal register of Egyptian royal inscriptions, suggesting that whatever political calculations underpinned royal marriages in ancient Egypt, Ramesses' affection for this particular wife appears to have been both genuine and, for a pharaoh, unusually openly expressed. Nefertari's own tomb in the Valley of the Queens, discovered in the early 20th century, contains some of the most exquisitely preserved and beautifully painted burial chambers anywhere in Egypt, its vivid, jewel-toned depictions of the Queen's journey through the afterlife earning it a reputation among Egyptologists as perhaps the single finest painted tomb in the entire country, though its extraordinarily delicate condition has required it to be closed to general public visitation for extended periods to prevent humidity and foot traffic from damaging its irreplaceable artwork. Ramesses II also fought one of the best documented battles of the ancient world, the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittite Empire, around 1274 BCE, a massive chariot engagement that Ramesses claimed as a great personal victory in inscriptions across Egypt, though the actual outcome was likely closer to a strategic stalemate. Years later, Ramesses and the Hittite king Hattusili III concluded what is often cited as the earliest known peace treaty in recorded history, a document detailing mutual non-aggression and extradition arrangements, copies of which survive both in Egyptian hieroglyphs and in the Hittite language, carved on clay tablets. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty holds a place of genuine symbolic importance in the modern world, and a large replica of the treaty text hangs today in the United Nations headquarters in New York, presented as an early testament to humanity's capacity for negotiated peace even between rival great powers following prolonged conflict. The treaty's terms included provisions for mutual defense against common enemies, a promise not to shelter each other's political refugees, and an unusually personal touch, Both rulers invoked their respective pantheons of gods as witnesses and guarantors of the agreement, a diplomatic convention that gave the treaty's obligations a sacred and therefore more binding character in the eyes of both ancient societies. The peace established by this treaty proved remarkably durable, holding for the remainder of both rulers' reigns and helping usher in an extended period of relative stability across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, eventually reinforced by a diplomatic marriage between Ramesses and a Hittite princess, a common and effective ancient Near Eastern practice for cementing political alliances between formerly hostile powers. One of the most fascinating and unusual episodes of the New Kingdom occurred during the reign of Akhenaten, Ramesses's distant predecessor, who came to power around 1353 BCE and initiated a religious revolution unlike anything else in Egyptian history. Akhenaten rejected the traditional pantheon of gods and promoted the worship of a single deity, the Aten, represented as a sun disk whose rays ended in small hands, believed to be the one true source of all life. He relocated the capital to a newly built city called Akhetaten in the desert at modern Amman, and encouraged an artistic style dramatically different from the rigid formality of earlier Egyptian art, more naturalistic, more intimate, depicting the royal family in relaxed, affectionate poses, playing with their children, a startling departure from centuries of convention. Akhenaten's chief wife, Nefertiti, became one of the most iconic figures of ancient Egypt, her image immortalized in a strikingly beautiful painted limestone bust discovered in 1912 and now housed in Berlin, its serene, symmetrical features making it one of the most recognizable works of art from the ancient world. Some scholars believe Nefertiti may have ruled briefly as pharaoh in her own right after her husband's death, though the evidence remains genuinely debated among Egyptologists. Akhenaten's religious revolution did not survive him. Within years of his death, Egypt's priesthood and political establishment restored the traditional pantheon, abandoned the city of Akhetaten, and worked to erase Akhenaten's memory from official records, viewing his monotheistic experiment as a dangerous heresy. It was during this restoration, under Akhenaten's young successor, his son or son-in-law, that the boy king took the throne, changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, reflecting the return to the god Amun, and briefly ruled before his own early death and the tomb discovery that would make him, 3,000 years later, the most famous pharaoh in the world. The New Kingdom was not simply an age of monument building, but also one of Egypt's most internationally connected periods, when Egyptian pharaohs corresponded as diplomatic equals with the great powers of the ancient Near East, including the Hittites, the Babylonians, and the Kingdom of Mitanni. A remarkable cache of clay tablets discovered at Amarna, written mostly in the Akkadian language that served as the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient Near East, preserves this correspondence in extraordinary detail, including marriage negotiations between royal houses, requests for gold, and the sometimes surprisingly petty complaints of foreign rulers who felt Egypt was not sending gifts generous enough to match their own. Toward the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt faced a genuinely existential threat from a mysterious coalition of seafaring raiders that Egyptian records call the Sea Peoples, whose origins remain debated among historians but who are believed to have contributed to the broader collapse of Bronze Age civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE, bringing down the Hittite Empire entirely and severely disrupting Mycenaean Greece. Pharaoh Ramesses III successfully repelled a major invasion by these sea peoples in a great land and naval battle around 1175 BCE, depicted in extraordinary detail on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, and this victory is often credited with allowing Egypt to survive, at least in weakened form, a period of collapse that ended numerous other Bronze Age civilizations entirely. Nevertheless, the strain of these conflicts, combined with economic pressures and internal political fragmentation, marked the beginning of a long, slow decline in Egyptian centralized power that would characterize the centuries following the New Kingdom's end. The centuries following the collapse of the New Kingdom around 1070 BCE brought a long, complex period of shifting fortunes, foreign rule, and occasional Egyptian resurgence that historians group together as the Third Intermediate Period and the Late Period. Perhaps the most fascinating episode of this era came around 747 BCE, when kings from Nubia, the Kingdom of Kush to the south of Egypt, conquered and unified the fractured Egyptian territories, establishing what Egyptologists call the 25th dynasty. These Nubian pharaohs, ruling from their southern capital and eventually from Egyptian cities as well, presented themselves as restorers of authentic Egyptian tradition, reviving pyramid construction, albeit at a smaller, steeper scale than the Old Kingdom monuments, and sponsoring temple building and religious practices with a reverence for ancient Egyptian custom that surpassed even that of many native Egyptian rulers. Modern archaeological surveys have revealed that more pyramids were ultimately built in Nubia, in what is now Sudan, than in Egypt itself, a genuinely surprising fact that runs counter to the popular association of pyramids exclusively with Egyptian territory, and that speaks to just how deeply Nubian culture had absorbed and then perpetuated core elements of pharaonic Egyptian civilization. Nubian rule in Egypt eventually gave way to conquest by the Assyrian Empire, and subsequently to a genuine native Egyptian revival under the 26th dynasty, based in the delta city of Sais, during which Egypt experienced a final flourishing of independent pharaonic culture, artistic achievement, and international trade before a far more consequential conquest arrived from the east. In 525 BCE, the Persian Achaemenid Empire under Cambyses II conquered Egypt, incorporating it as a satrapy, a Persian administrative province within the largest empire the ancient world had yet seen. Persian rule proved deeply unpopular among many Egyptians, provoking repeated rebellions and periods of renewed, if often short-lived, native independence until Alexander the Great's arrival in 332 BCE, welcomed by Egyptians precisely because he offered liberation from the resented Persian yoke, setting the stage for the Ptolemaic dynasty and the story of Cleopatra that we explore next. By the time we reach the final centuries of pharaonic Egypt, the civilization had already endured for well over 2,500 years, weathering periods of foreign conquest by Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, and Persians, each of whom, in turn, ruled the Nile Valley before Egyptian independence, in one form or another, was restored. The final chapter of independent pharaonic rule began in 332 BCE, when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt from the Persians, welcomed by Egyptians as a liberator rather than a conqueror. After Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy took control of Egypt, founding a Greek-speaking dynasty that would rule the country for nearly 3 centuries, adopting the outward trappings of pharaonic kingship, including, in a practice that startled their Greek contemporaries but echoed earlier Egyptian traditions, marriage between siblings, while governing from the newly built cosmopolitan city of Alexandria. The last and by far the most famous ruler of this Ptolemaic dynasty was Cleopatra VII, who came to the throne in 51 BCE at around 18 years of age. Cleopatra was, by all contemporary accounts, extraordinarily intelligent and politically formidable, fluent in numerous languages including Egyptian itself, a linguistic accomplishment none of her Greek predecessors had bothered to achieve in nearly 300 years of rule. And she navigated the treacherous final decades of the Roman Republic with remarkable skill, forming political and personal alliances first with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony in an effort to preserve Egyptian independence against the rising power of Rome. Her relationship with Mark Antony and their combined opposition to Antony's rival Octavian culminated in the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where their forces were decisively defeated. The following year, with Octavian's forces closing in on Alexandria and further resistance clearly futile, both Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives, Antony by the sword, and Cleopatra, according to the most enduring account, by the bite of an asp, though the precise circumstances of her death remain a matter of historical debate. Her death in 30 BCE marked the end of nearly 3,000 years of pharaonic rule and the absorption of Egypt into the Roman Empire as a prized personal province of the emperor, its enormous grain harvests thereafter feeding the city of Rome itself. It is worth pausing on the sheer scale of time involved here. Cleopatra lived closer in time to the moon landing than she did to the construction of the Great Pyramid. When she gazed upon the pyramids of Giza, as she certainly did, since they stood only a short distance from Alexandria, She was looking at monuments already more ancient to her than the fall of the Roman Empire is to us today. Egyptian history does not simply span a long time. It spans so much time that even the Egyptians who lived within it experienced their own civilization as something ancient, layered, and mysterious. It is worth noting that the popular image of Cleopatra, shaped heavily by centuries of European art, literature, and film, often bears little resemblance to how she would have actually appeared or understood herself. Contemporary coins bearing her image show a woman with a strong, prominent nose and a determined expression, closer to the conventions of Hellenistic royal portraiture than to any standard of idealized beauty, suggesting that her renown, charisma, and political influence rested far more on her intelligence, wit, and command of multiple languages than on physical appearance alone, a fact several ancient writers, including the historian Plutarch, explicitly emphasized. At the Temple of Dendera, dedicated to the goddess Hathor, an enormous relief carving depicts Cleopatra in full traditional pharaonic style, wearing the horned headdress associated with Hathor and Isis, standing alongside her son Caesarion, whom she claimed was fathered by Julius Caesar and positioned as heir to both Egyptian and, implicitly, Roman power. This carving represents one of the last monumental depictions of a pharaoh created in the ancient Egyptian artistic tradition. Before that tradition, after nearly 3,000 years of continuous practice, finally came to an end. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE and named, with characteristic modesty, after himself, grew within a few generations into one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a bustling cosmopolitan port where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and countless other communities lived, traded, and exchanged ideas along the Mediterranean coast. The city's most celebrated institution was its great library, founded under the early Ptolemaic rulers and intended, according to ancient accounts, to collect a copy of every book in the known world. Scholars from across the Mediterranean and Near East traveled to Alexandria to study at the attached research institute, called the Mouseion, and the library became the greatest center of learning in the ancient world, its scholars making significant advances in mathematics, astronomy, geography, and medicine. The mathematician Euclid, whose geometric principles are still taught in classrooms today, worked in Alexandria. So did Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the Earth with startling accuracy using nothing more than the angle of shadows cast at noon in two different cities and the known distance between them. The eventual fate of the library remains one of history's more debated tragedies, with damage occurring across several distinct episodes over centuries, including during Julius Caesar's siege of the city in 48 BCE, and through gradual decline and neglect in the centuries that followed, rather than in the single dramatic conflagration that popular legend often imagines. Whatever the precise cause, the loss of so much ancient knowledge remains one of history's great what-ifs, a reminder of how much of humanity's early intellectual achievement has simply vanished, leaving only fragments, references, and tantalizing hints of what once existed. Equally celebrated was the Lighthouse of Alexandria, built on the island of Pharos around 280 BCE and standing, by most ancient estimates, well over 100 meters tall, making it one of the tallest structures in the ancient world and one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world recognized by classical writers. The lighthouse guided ships into Alexandria's harbor for well over 1,000 years before a series of earthquakes between the 12th and 14th centuries brought it down entirely, its fallen stones eventually incorporated into a medieval fortress built on the same site. In recent decades, underwater archaeologists have located and catalogued substantial remains of the lighthouse and other ancient structures scattered across the seabed of Alexandria's harbor, offering tantalizing physical evidence of a wonder that, for over a millennium, existed only in written description. Following Cleopatra's death, Egypt settled into nearly 7 centuries as a province of the Roman and later Byzantine Empire. This period produced a fascinating cultural fusion, visible especially in the funerary art of the era. Where mummification continued as a practice, Egyptians of this period were still preparing their dead for the traditional journey into the afterlife. But the painted portraits placed over the faces of mummies, known today as Fayum portraits after the region where many were discovered, display a startlingly naturalistic, almost photographic Greco-Roman painting style. the eyes of these ancient individuals gazing out with an immediacy that feels remarkably modern even 2,000 years later. It was also during this Roman and Byzantine period that Christianity took deep root in Egypt, and the country became home to one of the earliest and most influential Christian communities in the world, producing towering theological figures and giving rise to the tradition of Christian monasticism itself. Saint Anthony, often called the father of Christian monasticism, retreated into the Egyptian desert in the 3rd century CE, and the monastery built in his honor near the Red Sea coast remains an active monastic community to this day, one of the oldest continuously inhabited monasteries in the world. The Coptic Orthodox Church, which traces its founding to Saint Mark the Evangelist in the 1st century CE, remains the largest Christian denomination in Egypt today, its distinctive liturgy still incorporating elements of the ancient Egyptian language, a faint but genuine linguistic echo of the pharaohs surviving in the prayers of the modern church. The story of Alexandria's great ancient library, and the profound loss the world suffered when it eventually disappeared, did not end with resignation. In 2002, after years of international fundraising, architectural competition, and construction, Egypt opened the Bibliotheca Alexandrina on the Alexandria waterfront, not far from the presumed site of the ancient library, a striking modern building designed by a Norwegian architectural firm in the shape of a great tilted disc, evoking a rising sun, its curved granite exterior wall carved with characters from virtually every known writing system in human history, a deliberate architectural gesture toward the ancient library's original ambition of gathering the knowledge of the entire world. Inside, a vast single-room reading hall, illuminated by geometric skylights that flood the space with soft, diffused natural light throughout the day, holds space for millions of volumes, along with specialized research centers, a planetarium, and exhibition spaces, functioning today as a significant cultural and academic institution for Egypt and the wider region. While no one imagines the new Bibliotheca Alexandrina can simply replace what was lost from the ancient world, that loss remains permanent and irreplaceable. A genuine wound in the history of human knowledge, its construction represents something meaningful nonetheless, a modern nation's conscious decision to honor and reclaim a legacy of learning and openness that stretches back over 2,000 years, situating contemporary Alexandria once again, however modestly, within a tradition of scholarship and cultural exchange that once made this city one of the intellectual centers of the entire ancient world. Not far from Cairo, but distinct from the narrow Nile Valley itself, lies the Fayum, a large, fertile depression fed by a natural channel from the Nile and centered on Lake Karun, one of the oldest lakes in the world, still in something resembling its ancient form, though dramatically reduced in size and increasingly saline compared to its ancient extent. The Fayum has been inhabited and cultivated since at least the Middle Kingdom, when Egyptian pharaohs undertook major irrigation projects to expand agricultural land in the region, and it remains today an important agricultural area, known particularly for its production of fruit, including a notable variety of high-quality dates, olives, and grapes cultivated using irrigation techniques that trace their origins back thousands of years, even as modern pumps and canals have largely replaced ancient methods. The Fayum also holds particular importance for archaeologists, having yielded an extraordinary concentration of the Fayum mummy portraits mentioned earlier, those hauntingly lifelike Greco-Roman era painted faces placed over mummified remains, along with substantial papyrus archives that have provided historians with an unusually detailed window into the everyday economic and social life of Greco-Roman Egypt, including tax records, personal letters, and business contracts that bring the ordinary texture of ancient daily life into sharp, personal focus in a way that grander monuments and royal inscriptions rarely achieve. In 639 CE, an Arab army led by the general Amr ibn al-As entered Egypt, then under Byzantine rule, and within roughly 2 years had brought the country under the control of the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. The conquest was, by the standards of ancient warfare, relatively swift, aided by widespread dissatisfaction among Egypt's Coptic Christian population with Byzantine religious policies and taxation. Amr ibn Aulus founded a new garrison city called Fustat on the east bank of the Nile near the site of modern Cairo, and built there a mosque that bears his name, the oldest mosque in Africa, still standing, though much altered and expanded over the succeeding centuries. Over the following decades and centuries, Egypt's population gradually converted to Islam and gradually adopted the Arabic language. Though the transition was neither instant nor complete, significant Coptic Christian communities remained, and remain today, an integral part of Egyptian society, and elements of the ancient Egyptian language survived, particularly within Coptic liturgy, long after Arabic became the dominant tongue of daily life. Egypt passed through the hands of several successive Islamic dynasties in the centuries that followed: the Umayyads, ruling from distant Damascus, then the Abbasids, ruling from Baghdad, before, in 969 CE, a new dynasty called the Fatimids conquered Egypt and founded a new capital city just north of Fustat, a city they named Al-Qahira, the Victorious, which the Western world would come to know as Cairo. The Fatimids, who claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad's daughter Fatima and adhered to a branch of Shia Islam, transformed Cairo into a great center of learning and commerce. Their most enduring legacy is Al-Azhar, founded in 970 CE both as a mosque and, soon after, as an institution of higher learning, which continues today as one of the oldest universities in the world and remains one of the most prestigious and influential centers of Sunni Islamic scholarship anywhere on earth. Its opinions on religious matters carrying weight across the entire Muslim world. Al-Azhar's physical structure itself tells the story of nearly 1,000 years of continuous religious and educational use, with successive rulers across many centuries adding new courtyards, minarets, and teaching halls to the original Fatimid mosque, creating an architectural palimpsest in which Fatimid, Mamluk, and Ottoman building styles all coexist within a single continuously functioning religious complex. Students have traveled to study at Al-Azhar from across the Islamic world for over a millennium, drawn by its reputation for rigorous religious scholarship, and this steady influx of scholars and students from distant lands helped cement Cairo's broader reputation as an intellectual capital of the Islamic world, a role the city had also played, in a different register, back in the days of the ancient library of Alexandria. The Fatimid dynasty, despite ruling from a position of religious minority as Shia Muslims governing a majority Sunni population, generally practiced a policy of considerable religious tolerance, and Cairo under Fatimid rule became home to thriving Coptic Christian and Jewish communities alongside the Muslim majority, each maintaining their own religious institutions, quarters, and communal life within the broader fabric of the city. A pattern of relatively peaceful religious coexistence that, with periodic exceptions and tensions across different eras, has remained a recurring characteristic of Cairo's social fabric across the many centuries since. The Fatimid dynasty eventually gave way, in the 12th century, to the famous general Saladin, who reunified Egypt under Sunni Islam, founded the Ayyubid dynasty, and famously led Muslim forces to victory over the Crusader states, recapturing Jerusalem in 1187 after nearly 90 years of Crusader rule. Saladin also built the Great Citadel of Cairo, a fortified complex on a rocky outcrop overlooking the city, which would remain the seat of Egyptian government for the next 700 years, its silhouette crowned centuries later by the elegant Ottoman-style mosque of Muhammad Ali, still dominating the Cairo skyline today. Following Saladin's dynasty came the Mamluks, a fascinating ruling class composed originally of enslaved soldiers, largely of Turkic and Circassian origin, who had been trained from a young age in military discipline and Islamic scholarship, and who rose, remarkably, to become Egypt's ruling elite for nearly 300 years, from the mid-13th century until the Ottoman conquest in 1517. The Mamluks successfully repelled the Mongol invasions that had devastated much of the rest of the Islamic world in the 13th century, and they left behind an extraordinary architectural legacy: hundreds of mosques, madrasas, and mausoleums throughout Cairo, many still standing today, their intricate stonework and soaring minarets earning Cairo, in this era, its enduring nickname as the City of a Thousand Minarets. Mamluk-era Cairo also became one of the wealthiest and most important commercial cities in the entire medieval world, serving as a crucial hub along the trade routes connecting the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean and, through it, the spice-producing regions of South and Southeast Asia. Camel caravans arrived regularly from across Africa and Arabia, bringing gold, ivory, and enslaved people from sub-Saharan kingdoms, while ships arriving through the Red Sea ports brought spices, textiles, and luxury goods from India and beyond, all of which passed through Cairo's markets before continuing on to Europe, generating enormous customs revenue and cementing Cairo's reputation as one of the great cosmopolitan crossroads of the medieval world. This commercial prosperity funded the extraordinary architectural achievements for which Mamluk Cairo remains famous, with wealthy sultans and emirs competing to build ever more elaborate mosque, madrasa, mausoleum complexes, structures that combined places of worship, centers of religious education, and their own eventual tombs into single, architecturally unified buildings, a distinctly Mamluk innovation that produced some of the most sophisticated Islamic architecture anywhere in the world. The distinctive black and white, or red and white striped stonework called ablaq, visible on many Mamluk buildings throughout Cairo today, along with elaborately carved stone domes featuring intricate geometric and floral patterns, represent a level of architectural and decorative sophistication that took centuries of accumulated craft knowledge to develop, much of which was subsequently lost or diminished following the eventual Ottoman conquest, when Cairo's political and economic importance began a long, gradual decline relative to Constantinople. Cairo today is one of the largest urban areas in Africa and the Middle East, home to more than 20 million people when its greater metropolitan area is counted, a sprawling, endlessly energetic city that has served in one form or another as Egypt's capital for over 1,000 years. The historic heart of the city, often called Islamic Cairo, remains a genuinely living neighborhood rather than a museum piece, its narrow, winding streets lined with medieval mosques, ancient gates, and centuries-old market stalls that continue to operate much as they always have. The Khan el-Khalili market, established in the 14th century, remains one of the most vibrant commercial districts in the city, its narrow lanes packed with shops selling spices, perfumes, gold, textiles, and handicrafts, the air thick with the mingled scents of cardamom, cumin, and freshly brewed mint tea. Merchants call out to passers-by with practiced charm, haggling is expected and even enjoyed as a form of social ritual, and small cafes tucked between the shops serve tea and shisha to shoppers taking a break from the crowds, their conversations blending into the market's constant, cheerful hum. The Nile flows directly through modern Cairo, its banks lined with a mixture of colonial-era buildings, modern high-rises, and public gardens, and the river remains, even today, a genuine focal point of city life. Feluccas, the traditional wooden sailboats that have plied the Nile for thousands of years, still carry passengers on leisurely evening cruises, their triangular sails catching the breeze as the sun sets behind the city's skyline, a scene that would have been recognizable, in its essential outline, to Egyptians living along this same river 3,000 years ago. There is a particular quality to an evening felucca ride on the Nile that visitors consistently describe as unexpectedly moving, an experience that somehow manages to feel both entirely ordinary and quietly profound. Away from the noise and motion of the surrounding city, gliding silently across water that has carried Egyptian life for the entire span of recorded human history, passengers often find themselves falling into an unplanned, comfortable silence, watching the lights of the city slide past, the felucca's captain making small, practiced adjustments to the sail with the ease of someone who has done this thousands of times before, the boat responding to wind and current in a manner entirely unmediated by engines or modern technology. It is perhaps one of the closest experiences available to modern visitors of what it might have felt like to travel this same river in any of the preceding 50 centuries, the fundamental relationship between boat, wind, and water having changed remarkably little even as everything on the surrounding banks has been transformed beyond recognition. Cairo's traffic, meanwhile, has become almost legendary in its intensity, a chaotic, honking, constantly shifting flow of cars, buses, motorbikes, and pedestrians that seems to defy any formal traffic system, and yet somehow, through an intuitive collective choreography that longtime residents navigate with practiced ease, manages to keep moving. Crossing a busy Cairo street as a first-time visitor can feel like an act of considerable courage, and locals often simply extend a hand, palm outward, toward oncoming traffic and step confidently into the flow, trusting that drivers will adjust around them, a trust that, remarkably, is almost always rewarded. Despite its size and its bustle, Cairo maintains an intimate, neighborhood-based social fabric, where residents of a particular street or block often know one another closely, where small local grocers and bakers form the backbone of daily commerce, and where the rhythms of the day are marked, as they have been for over 1,000 years, by the 5 daily calls to prayer echoing from minarets across the city, a sound so woven into the texture of Cairo life that longtime residents describe barely noticing it consciously anymore, even as it structures their entire day. Evenings in Cairo often stretch late into the night, particularly during the warmer months, when the daytime heat gives way to more comfortable temperatures and families and friends gather in outdoor cafes, on rooftops, or along the Nile corniche to socialize, smoke shisha, drink tea, and talk for hours in a manner that visitors from more schedule-driven cultures often find both bewildering and, eventually, deeply appealing. Islamic Cairo's architectural heritage extends across nearly 1,000 years of continuous building, and few streets anywhere in the world offer as dense and unbroken a display of historic Islamic architecture as Al-Muiz Street, a roughly 1-kilometer pedestrian corridor running through the heart of the old city, lined on both sides with mosques, mausoleums, fountains, and merchant houses dating from the Fatimid period all the way through the Ottoman era, each building constructed by a different ruler or wealthy patron eager to leave a lasting mark on the city's skyline and, not incidentally, to secure charitable religious credit that Islamic tradition holds accrues to those who fund the construction of mosques and religious schools. The mosque madrasa of Sultan Hassan, completed in the 14th century, ranks among the largest and most architecturally accomplished religious buildings constructed anywhere in the medieval Islamic world. Its soaring entrance portal and vast central courtyard, surrounded by 4 enormous vaulted halls, each dedicated to teaching one of the 4 major schools of Sunni Islamic law, reflecting both the immense wealth of Mamluk Cairo and the serious intellectual and educational ambitions that accompanied that wealth. Standing in its central courtyard, looking up at walls rising over 30 meters on every side, visitors experience a scale of religious architecture that rivals the grandest cathedrals of medieval Europe, constructed during roughly the same centuries but reflecting an entirely distinct aesthetic and spiritual tradition. Beyond the historic core, modern Cairo has expanded dramatically outward in recent decades, with new satellite developments rising in the desert on the city's eastern and western fringes, offering more spacious, orderly housing in stark visual contrast to the dense, organic, centuries-old fabric of the historic districts. This expansion reflects the enormous pressure of Cairo's growing population, and it has produced a genuinely divided urban landscape, with wealthier residents increasingly relocating to gated compounds and planned communities on the city's outskirts, while the historic center and older, denser neighborhoods remain home to a broader cross-section of Cairo's population, preserving, often out of economic necessity as much as cultural preference, the close-knit, walkable, intensely social urban fabric that has characterized Cairo life for many centuries. Before we return to Cairo and the centuries that followed the Islamic conquest, it is worth traveling south, up the Nile, to the city that ancient Egyptians called Waset and the Greeks later renamed Thebes, the city we know today as Luxor. For much of Egyptian history, particularly during the Middle and New Kingdoms, Thebes served as the country's religious capital and at times its political capital as well, and the sheer density of monumental architecture concentrated in this one relatively small stretch of the Nile Valley remains almost impossible to comprehend, even having already traveled, in this documentary, through Giza, Saqqara, and the temples of Karnak. Luxor Temple itself, connected to the vast Karnak complex by a processional avenue lined with hundreds of Sphinx statues, some ram-headed and dedicated to the god Amun, was the site of an annual festival called Opet, during which statues of the Theban gods were carried in procession from Karnak to Luxor Temple, celebrating the renewal of kingship and the continued fertility of the land, a ceremony so important that it shaped the ritual calendar of the entire Theban region for well over 1,000 years. The nearly 3-kilometer processional avenue connecting the temples of Karnak and Luxor, lined on both sides with an estimated 1,300 Sphinx statues when originally complete, had been buried for centuries beneath the modern city that grew up around and, in places, directly on top of it, with houses, mosques, and even a church constructed along portions of its ancient route. A major excavation and restoration project, completed in 2021 after decades of painstaking archaeological work, finally cleared and restored the entire length of this avenue, requiring the careful relocation of some modern structures and generating occasional controversy over the balance between preserving ancient heritage and respecting the living, modern city that had grown up around it, a tension that recurs throughout Egypt wherever ancient monuments lie beneath or beside the continuously inhabited, continuously evolving cities of the present day. The ancient Opet festival itself, celebrated annually during the second month of the Nile flood season, involved days of public celebration, feasting, and ritual, during which ordinary Egyptians, normally excluded from the temple's innermost sanctuaries, had rare opportunities to approach and even briefly interact with the divine images as they passed by in procession, receiving oracles and blessings in a rare, sanctioned moment of direct contact between ordinary daily life and the otherwise carefully guarded sacred world of temple religion. On the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, opposite the temples of Karnak and Luxor, lies the vast necropolis that served as Thebes' city of the dead, an entire landscape dedicated to burial, memorial, and mortuary worship, stretching from the fertile floodplain up into the barren desert hills. The Colossi of Memnon, two enormous seated statues of Amenhotep III, stand alone today in the middle of agricultural fields, all that remains of what was once the largest mortuary temple ever built in Egypt, the rest of the structure having been dismantled by later rulers who reused its stone for their own building projects, leaving only these two colossal guardians to mark where the temple once stood. One of the statues became famous in antiquity for reportedly producing a strange singing or whistling sound at dawn, likely caused by temperature changes affecting cracks in the stone following earthquake damage, a phenomenon that attracted Greek and Roman tourists who traveled specifically to hear it and left behind graffiti recording their visits, some of the earliest known tourist inscriptions in human history. Nearby, the Ramesseum, the mortuary temple of Ramesses II, lies substantially ruined today, its fallen colossal statue of the pharaoh, once among the largest statues ever carved in Egypt, estimated to have weighed over 1,000 tons when complete, now lying broken and half buried in the sand, an image so evocative of the impermanence of even the greatest human ambitions that it directly inspired the English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley to write his famous poem about a shattered statue in the desert bearing the inscription, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Perhaps the single most valuable site for understanding the daily lives of ordinary ancient Egyptians is Deir el-Medina, a purpose-built village that housed the skilled artisans and craftsmen responsible for carving and decorating the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings across many generations. Because these workers were literate, an unusual circumstance for ordinary craftsmen in the ancient world, they left behind an extraordinary volume of personal documents, including letters, legal contracts, marriage records, medical complaints, and even a fascinating record of what may be history's first documented labor strike, when workers in the reign of Ramesses III walked off the job to protest delayed payment of their wages, which were paid not in coined money but in grain and other essential goods. These documents give historians an intimate, human-scale window into ancient Egyptian life entirely different from the grand religious and royal texts that dominate most surviving Egyptian writing, Arguments between neighbors, complaints about unfaithful spouses, requests for medical treatment, and the ordinary business of raising families and making a living, reminding us that behind every monument we have discussed tonight stood generations of ordinary people whose daily concerns were not so different from our own. While the vast majority of Egyptians throughout history have lived clustered along the Nile, a smaller but culturally significant population has always called Egypt's deserts home: the Bedouin, semi-nomadic Arab tribal peoples whose way of life, though increasingly influenced by modern settlement and tourism, retains many of its traditional characteristics, particularly in the Sinai Peninsula and along the western desert oases. Bedouin communities traditionally organized their lives around herding goats, sheep, and camels across territories whose boundaries were understood through tribal custom rather than formal maps, moving seasonally in search of water and grazing land in a pattern of life that required intimate, generations-deep knowledge of the desert's subtle features, which valleys held hidden water sources, which routes remained passable after rare but sometimes dangerous flash floods, and how to read the sky and the wind for signs of the sandstorms that periodically sweep across the open desert with startling speed and force. Bedouin hospitality traditions, like broader Egyptian hospitality but arguably even more elaborately codified, place enormous value on welcoming travelers and strangers, historically rooted in the practical reality that survival in the harsh desert environment often depended on this exact kind of mutual aid extended between people who might never meet again. A guest received into a Bedouin tent was traditionally guaranteed protection and hospitality for a set period, regardless of any prior conflict or dispute, a custom that speaks to the deep pragmatism underlying desert social codes, where the ability to rely on strangers in times of genuine need could mean the difference between life and death. In recent decades, the growth of tourism in the Sinai Peninsula, particularly around the Red Sea coastal resorts and the trekking routes near Mount Sinai and the rugged interior mountains, has transformed the economic life of many Bedouin communities, with traditional herding increasingly supplemented and in some families largely replaced by work as guides, drivers, and hospitality providers for visitors drawn to the desert's stark, dramatic beauty. This transition has brought genuine economic opportunity alongside significant cultural tension as younger generations navigate between the traditional knowledge and social structures of their elders and the different demands and opportunities of a tourism-based economy increasingly connected to global markets and expectations. Yet, even amid these changes, the fundamental character of Bedouin life, an intimate, hard-won relationship with one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth, sustained across countless generations through knowledge, endurance, and hospitality, remains a vital and distinctive thread within the broader tapestry of Egyptian identity, a reminder that the story of this country has never belonged solely to the Nile Valley, but to the deserts surrounding it as well. One of the most peaceful ways to experience Egypt, then and now, is simply to travel by boat along the stretch of the Nile between Luxor and Aswan, a journey that has been made by travelers, pilgrims, and traders for thousands of years, and that today remains one of the most popular ways for visitors to experience the country's ancient heritage at an unhurried, contemplative pace. Roughly halfway along this stretch of river sits the Temple of Efu, dedicated to the falcon god Horus and remarkably almost eerily well preserved compared to many other ancient Egyptian temples, having spent much of its history buried beneath desert sand and village construction, which paradoxically protected it from the stone robbing and deliberate destruction that damaged so many other ancient structures over the centuries. Excavated fully only in the 19th century, Edfu today offers visitors perhaps the clearest sense available anywhere in Egypt of what a complete ancient temple actually looked like, its towering entrance pylon, columned courtyards, and inner sanctuary all substantially intact, allowing modern visitors to walk through the same sequence of increasingly sacred, increasingly dark spaces that ancient priests once traversed on their way to tend the god's cult statue in the temple's innermost chamber. Further south, the unusual double temple of Kom Ombo, perched on a bend in the river, was dedicated jointly to two gods, the crocodile god Sobek and the falcon god Haroris, and features a rare, perfectly symmetrical design with duplicate entrances, courts, and sanctuaries running in parallel down each side of the building, reflecting the temple's dual religious purpose. An attached museum displays mummified crocodiles recovered from a nearby sacred animal cemetery, a striking reminder that ancient Egyptian religious practice extended reverence not only to human pharaohs and anthropomorphic deities, but to specific animal species believed to embody divine power. With crocodiles, in this particular region of the Nile, treated with a mixture of genuine fear and profound religious respect. Near Aswan itself, the temple complex of Philae, dedicated to the goddess Isis and one of the last places in the ancient world where the old Egyptian religion continued to be openly practiced, well into the Christian era, presents its own remarkable story of modern preservation. Like Abu Simbel, Philae faced complete submersion beneath the rising waters created by dam projects on the Nile. First the older Aswan Low Dam, and later the High Dam, and in another extraordinary feat of international archaeological engineering coordinated by UNESCO, the entire temple complex was carefully dismantled, moved stone by stone, and reconstructed on the nearby island of Agilkia, which was reshaped to resemble the temple's original island setting as closely as possible. Today, visitors reach Philae by small boat, arriving at the temple much as ancient pilgrims once did, the approach across the water adding a genuine sense of anticipation and gradual revelation to the experience of encountering this beautifully preserved sanctuary, its graceful columns and reliefs rising directly from the edge of the Nile's flowing water. In 1517, the Ottoman Empire, based in Constantinople, conquered Egypt, ending 3 centuries of Mamluk rule and incorporating the country into the vast Ottoman imperial system as a province, though the Mamluks retained considerable local power and influence even under nominal Ottoman authority, a somewhat unusual arrangement that persisted for roughly 3 centuries. Egypt's modern history took a dramatic turn in 1798, when the French general Napoleon Bonaparte invaded the country, ostensibly to disrupt British trade routes to India but also, characteristically, bringing along a large team of scholars and scientists whose work would launch the modern academic field of Egyptology. Napoleon's soldiers discovered, in 1799, a broken slab of granite near the town of Rosetta, inscribed with the same decree written in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, a simplified Egyptian script called Demotic, and ancient Greek. This Rosetta Stone, eventually seized by British forces after Napoleon's defeat in Egypt and now housed in the British Museum, provided the crucial key that allowed the French scholar Jean-François Champollion, after years of painstaking work, to finally decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs in 1822, unlocking, after nearly 2,000 years of silence, the ability to read the words the ancient Egyptians themselves had written, and transforming Egyptology from speculative guesswork into genuine historical science. Before Champollion's breakthrough, centuries of European scholars had speculated wildly and often wrongly about the meaning of hieroglyphic writing, with many assuming, incorrectly, that the symbols represented purely symbolic or mystical concepts rather than an actual functioning system for recording spoken language, an assumption that led generations of earlier researchers entirely astray in their attempts at interpretation. Champollion's genius lay partly in his willingness to consider that hieroglyphs might function, at least in part, as a genuine phonetic script recording actual Egyptian speech sounds, an insight he confirmed by comparing royal names enclosed in oval cartouches on the Rosetta Stone with the known Greek names in the accompanying Greek text, gradually building up an alphabet of phonetic hieroglyphic signs that he could then apply to decipher increasingly complex inscriptions. The personal dedication behind this achievement is remarkable in its own right. Champollion had been fascinated by ancient Egypt since childhood, reportedly declaring at the age of 16 his intention to decipher hieroglyphic writing, and he pursued this singular goal with relentless focus for the following 2 decades, teaching himself Coptic, the last living descendant of the ancient Egyptian language, still used liturgically by the Coptic Church, in the belief, ultimately proven correct, that it would provide crucial clues to understanding the vocabulary and grammar underlying the far more ancient hieroglyphic script. Upon finally confirming his breakthrough decipherment, Champollion reportedly rushed to his brother's office in Paris, cried out, "Je tiens l'affaire, I've got it," and promptly fainted from exhaustion and excitement, collapsing after 2 decades of obsessive scholarly pursuit had finally reached its triumphant conclusion. Following Napoleon's withdrawal, an Albanian Ottoman military commander named Muhammad Ali seized control of Egypt in 1805 and, over the following decades, transformed the country through an ambitious program of modernization, building a modern army, developing industry, reforming agriculture, and founding a dynasty that would rule Egypt in various forms until the middle of the 20th century. Muhammad Ali is often regarded as the founder of modern Egypt, and his descendants would rule the country as Khedives and later as kings through a period of increasing entanglement with European powers. The single most consequential development of this era was the construction of the Suez Canal, connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea and, by extension, to the Indian Ocean, eliminating the need for ships to sail all the way around the African continent. The canal, designed by the French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps and built largely with Egyptian labor under often brutal conditions, opened in 1869 after a decade of construction, instantly transforming global trade routes and making Egypt a matter of intense strategic interest to the great powers of Europe, particularly Britain, whose trade routes to India now depended heavily on safe passage through the canal. The massive debts Egypt incurred financing the canal and other modernization projects eventually left the country financially vulnerable, and in 1882 Britain occupied Egypt militarily, ostensibly to protect its financial and strategic interests, beginning a period of British colonial dominance that would persist, in various formal and informal arrangements, for the following 70 years, even as Egypt technically remained, for much of this period, a nominally independent kingdom under the Muhammad Ali dynasty. This colonial period generated deep and growing Egyptian nationalist sentiment, expressed through periodic uprisings, political movements, and a persistent, ultimately unstoppable desire among Egyptians to reclaim full sovereignty over their own country and, crucially, over the strategically vital canal that ran through it. The human cost of building the Suez Canal deserves particular acknowledgement, since it is easily obscured by the canal's undeniable engineering significance and ongoing economic importance. An estimated 1.5 million Egyptian laborers were conscripted to work on the canal's construction over the course of the decade it took to complete, many through a forced labor system called the corvée. Working under grueling conditions with primitive tools for much of the project's early years, before increasing mechanization gradually reduced the reliance on manual labor. Estimates of the death toll from disease, accidents, and the sheer physical demands of the work vary considerably among historians, but most suggest tens of thousands of Egyptian workers died during the canal's construction, a sobering human cost behind an achievement often celebrated primarily for its engineering brilliance and global economic significance. Colonial-era Egypt, particularly the cosmopolitan port city of Alexandria, developed a genuinely diverse, multicultural character during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, home to substantial Greek, Italian, French, Armenian, and Jewish communities alongside the Egyptian majority, each contributing to a rich, distinctive urban culture reflected in the city's architecture, cuisine, and literary life. This cosmopolitan Alexandria produced significant literary figures, including the poet Constantine Cavafy, a Greek Alexandrian whose evocative poetry captured the fading grandeur and lingering sensuality of a city he loved with genuine, complicated devotion, and whose work remains celebrated internationally as among the finest Greek-language poetry of the 20th century, remarkable testimony to how thoroughly Alexandria's ancient role as a meeting point of cultures persisted, in transformed but recognizable form, well into the modern era. Much of this cosmopolitan character diminished significantly following Egyptian independence and the nationalization policies of the Nasser era, when many members of these foreign communities departed the country, but their architectural and cultural legacy remains visible throughout Alexandria's older neighborhoods today, in grand, faded apartment buildings, elegant old cafes, and a general urban atmosphere that still feels distinctly different from the more thoroughly Arab character of Cairo. If there is one thread that ties together every era of Egyptian history we have traveled through tonight, it is stone, and the enduring Egyptian instinct to build things meant to last far longer than any single human lifetime. Ancient Egyptian builders worked primarily with limestone, quarried locally in enormous quantities along the Nile Valley, along with harder stones like granite, transported from quarries near Aswan for use in the most important structural and decorative elements, where its durability and capacity to hold a fine polish made it especially prized for obelisks, sarcophagi, and the casing stones that once covered the pyramids in a smooth, gleaming white surface, long since stripped away by later builders who reused the stone for their own construction projects. This same limestone casing, when intact, would have made the Great Pyramid genuinely blinding to look at under the Egyptian sun, its capstone likely covered in gold or electrum to catch and reflect the first and last light of each day, a detail almost impossible to imagine now, looking at the weathered, honey-colored stone core that remains exposed today. The transportation of massive stone blocks across considerable distances represents one of ancient Egypt's most impressive and least visually obvious engineering achievements, relying heavily on the Nile itself as a highway, with barges carrying stone blocks downstream and, during the flood season, allowing boats to approach construction sites directly across temporarily flooded land that would otherwise have required laborious overland hauling. A clever seasonal adaptation that turned the annual inundation so central to Egyptian agriculture into an equally central tool of Egyptian construction. It is worth remembering that stone architecture, however dominant in the historical record and the popular imagination, represented only a small fraction of ancient Egyptian construction. The overwhelming majority of ancient Egyptian buildings, including the homes of pharaohs themselves during their lifetimes, were built from mud brick, a cheap, practical, and readily available material formed from Nile mud mixed with straw and dried in the sun. Stone was reserved almost exclusively for temples and tombs, structures intended for eternity, for the gods and the dead, while the world of the living, however grand, was built to be renewed and rebuilt across generations, a philosophy of construction that draws a striking, almost poetic distinction between the impermanence the Egyptians accepted for daily life and the permanence they sought so single-mindedly for the afterlife. This same practical mud brick tradition continues today in rural Egyptian villages, where traditional homes are still constructed using techniques not dramatically different from those employed thousands of years ago, even as reinforced concrete has become the dominant building material in Egyptian cities, producing the distinctive, often visually unfinished appearance of much contemporary Egyptian urban architecture, with rooftops left with exposed rebar and unfinished upper floors, a common practice partly rooted in tax regulations that historically assessed completed buildings differently than those still technically under construction, encouraging homeowners to leave a floor perpetually unfinished, ready for a future generation's expansion. In July 1952, a group of military officers known as the Free Officers Movement overthrew Egypt's monarchy in a largely bloodless coup, ending the rule of King Farouk and within a few years establishing a republic. The most influential figure to emerge from this movement was Gamal Abdel Nasser, who became Egypt's president in 1956 and would go on to become one of the most significant and charismatic leaders in the modern Arab world, championing a vision of pan-Arab nationalism and non-alignment during the tense years of the Cold War. Nasser's decision in 1956 to nationalize the Suez Canal Company, taking control of the canal from its British and French shareholders, triggered a brief but internationally consequential conflict when Britain, France, and Israel launched a coordinated military invasion of Egypt. Under intense diplomatic pressure from both the United States and the Soviet Union, the invading forces withdrew, and the episode, remembered as the Suez Crisis, marked a symbolic and genuinely significant turning point in global history, demonstrating that the old European colonial powers could no longer act unilaterally in the Middle East without deference to the new superpowers, and cementing Nasser's status as a hero of anti-colonial resistance across much of the developing world. Nasser's charisma and his skillful use of radio broadcasting, particularly through the influential Voice of the Arabs station, made him a genuinely transformative figure not only in Egypt but across the wider Arab world, where his speeches, broadcast to audiences from Morocco to Iraq, articulated a vision of pan-Arab unity and dignity that resonated powerfully with populations across the region still grappling with the legacy of European colonialism. Nasser's brand of Arab nationalism briefly produced a formal political union between Egypt and Syria, called the United Arab Republic, from 1958 to 1961, an ambitious experiment in pan-Arab statehood that ultimately dissolved amid practical governance difficulties and Syrian dissatisfaction with what many Syrians perceived as excessive Egyptian dominance within the Union. But the very attempt reflected the genuine intensity of pan-Arab aspiration during this period. Nasser also positioned Egypt as a leading voice within the broader non-aligned movement, a loose association of newly independent developing nations seeking to chart an independent course during the Cold War rather than aligning fully with either the American-led Western Bloc or the Soviet-led Communist Bloc, working alongside figures like India's Jawaharlal Nehru, Yugoslavia's Josip Broz Tito, and Indonesia's Sukarno to articulate an alternative vision of international relations centered on decolonization, mutual respect for sovereignty, and cooperative development among formerly colonized nations, a legacy of Egyptian diplomatic engagement that continued to shape the country's foreign policy orientation for decades afterward. Nasser also pursued ambitious modernization projects, most notably the construction of the Aswan High Dam, completed in 1970 with substantial Soviet financial and technical assistance after Western powers withdrew their support amid Cold War tensions. The dam, as discussed earlier, transformed Egyptian agriculture and energy production, though it also required the relocation of tens of thousands of Nubian people whose ancestral homeland along the Nile was flooded to create Lake Nasser, a significant and still remembered human cost of the project's undeniable benefits. The Nubian relocation, carried out in the early 1960s as Lake Nasser's waters began rising behind the newly constructed dam, ranks among the largest and most consequential population displacements in modern Egyptian history, ultimately affecting well over 100,000 people across both Egyptian and Sudanese Nubia, whose ancestral villages, agricultural land, and historic sites disappeared permanently beneath the reservoir's rising waters. Displaced Nubian families were resettled primarily in newly constructed communities near Kom Ombo and Aswan, considerably further from the river and from the specific ancestral lands many families had occupied for countless generations, and the psychological and cultural impact of this displacement, severing communities from geography deeply woven into their collective identity and historical memory, has left a lasting imprint on Nubian cultural consciousness that persists strongly even among generations born well after the relocation itself occurred. Despite the very real hardship and loss involved, the international archaeological rescue effort that accompanied the dam's construction, most famously relocating the temples of Abu Simbel and Philae to higher ground, stands as one of history's most extraordinary examples of large-scale heritage preservation, demonstrating that even amid the disruption of a major modern infrastructure project, the international community proved capable of mobilizing extraordinary resources and expertise to save irreplaceable monuments from a fate that would otherwise have erased them from the visible landscape entirely, even as the human communities living around those monuments experienced disruption of their own that has proven, in many respects, considerably harder to fully address or repair. Egypt fought several wars with Israel during this period, most significantly the Six-Day War of 1967, which resulted in a decisive Israeli victory and the loss of the Sinai Peninsula, and the October War of 1973, which, though militarily inconclusive, restored a measure of Egyptian and Arab pride and paved the way for subsequent diplomatic engagement. Nasser's successor, Anwar Sadat, took the historic step of visiting Israel in 1977 and subsequently negotiating the Camp David Accords in 1978, leading to a formal peace treaty between Egypt and Israel in 1979, the first such treaty between Israel and any Arab nation, through which Egypt regained the Sinai Peninsula in exchange for formal recognition of Israel. This peace, while diplomatically significant and enduring to this day, proved deeply controversial within the broader Arab world and among segments of Egyptian society, and Sadat was assassinated by Islamist militants in 1981 during a military parade commemorating the 1973 war. Sadat's decision to pursue peace with Israel represented a genuinely dramatic break from the pan-Arab solidarity that had characterized Nasser's foreign policy, and it carried enormous personal and political risk, ultimately proving fatal. In the immediate aftermath of the peace treaty, Egypt found itself suspended from the Arab League and diplomatically isolated from many of its neighbors, who viewed Sadat's separate peace as a betrayal of the broader Arab and Palestinian cause, a rift that took over a decade to fully heal as other Arab states gradually normalized relations with Egypt through the 1980s and beyond. Within Egypt itself, opinion remained genuinely divided, with many Egyptians appreciating the tangible benefits of peace, reduced military spending, the return of the Sinai Peninsula, and improved relations with the United States, while others, particularly within Islamist political movements that had been gaining strength throughout the 1970s, viewed the treaty as an unacceptable capitulation, sentiments that ultimately culminated in the group of military officers linked to Islamist militant networks who assassinated Sadat during the very parade meant to celebrate Egyptian military achievement. Sadat's assassination and the tensions surrounding it foreshadowed a broader, ongoing struggle within Egyptian society over the proper relationship between religion and state, tradition and modernization, and Egypt's place within both the Arab world and the wider international community, tensions that would continue to shape Egyptian politics for decades afterward through the Mubarak era, the 2011 revolution, and into the present day. Sadat's successor, Hosni Mubarak, would go on to rule Egypt for nearly 30 years, presiding over a period of relative stability accompanied by growing frustrations over political repression, economic inequality, and limited freedoms. These frustrations erupted dramatically in January 2011 when mass protests centered in Cairo's Tahrir Square, part of the broader wave of uprisings across the Arab world, often called the Arab Spring, led to Mubarak's resignation after 18 days of sustained demonstrations that captured the attention of the entire world. The years that followed proved politically turbulent, including a brief period of rule by the Muslim Brotherhood under President Mohamed Morsi, his removal by the military in 2013 amid further mass protests, and the subsequent presidency of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, under whom Egypt has pursued major infrastructure and development projects, including a new administrative capital being built in the desert east of Cairo, intended eventually to house the seat of government and relieve some of the immense pressure on the overcrowded historic city. The 18 days of protests centered in Tahrir Square in January and February 2011 represented a genuinely remarkable moment in modern Egyptian history, drawing together an unusually broad coalition of Egyptians, secular activists, Islamist organizers, labor unions, young people organizing largely through social media, and ordinary citizens frustrated by decades of accumulated economic and political grievances into a sustained, largely peaceful mass demonstration that succeeded in forcing the resignation of a president who had held power for nearly 3 decades. The images broadcast around the world during those 18 days, massive crowds filling Tahrir Square day and night, improvised medical stations treating the injured, ordinary Egyptians of every background standing together in a square that had, until that moment, been simply a busy traffic roundabout in downtown Cairo, captured global attention and inspired hope, both within Egypt and across the wider Arab world, that a genuinely new political era might be dawning. The subsequent years proved considerably more complicated than those hopeful early days suggested, as Egypt navigated a difficult and often turbulent transition through a period of military caretaker rule, a democratically elected but ultimately controversial Muslim Brotherhood government, and finally another period of military-led governance under President Sisi, whose administration has emphasized stability and economic development while facing ongoing criticism from human rights organizations regarding political freedoms and civil liberties. This complicated, still unfolding recent history reflects a broader pattern visible across much of Egypt's long story, a persistent tension between the desire for stability and continuity, so deeply embedded in a civilization that has always valued permanence and order, and the equally persistent, recurring desire among Egyptians across many centuries to reshape their own political destiny, whether that meant overthrowing a pharaoh who had lost the mandate of the gods, expelling a foreign occupier, or filling a public square to demand the resignation of a modern president. Egypt's economy today rests on a combination of pillars that would have been at least partially recognizable to observers across many centuries of the country's history: alongside genuinely new industries shaped by the modern global economy. Agriculture, though now a smaller share of the overall economy than in past centuries, remains vital. With the Nile Valley and Delta producing cotton of exceptional quality, Egyptian long staple cotton remains prized worldwide for luxury textiles, along with rice, wheat, sugarcane, and a wide variety of fruits and vegetables, much of it exported to markets across Europe and the Middle East. Tourism, drawing on the almost unparalleled density of ancient monuments we have explored throughout this documentary, along with the country's Red Sea beaches and diving destinations, has become one of Egypt's largest sources of foreign currency, employing millions of Egyptians directly and indirectly. Though the industry has proven vulnerable to periodic disruption from regional political instability and, more recently, global health crises, prompting ongoing government efforts to diversify and stabilize the tourism sector. The Suez Canal continues to generate substantial revenue as one of the world's most critical shipping arteries, and a major expansion project completed in 2015 added a new parallel channel allowing two-way traffic along a significant stretch of the waterway, increasing its capacity and reducing transit times for the thousands of vessels that pass through each year, carrying a substantial percentage of all global maritime trade. The canal's continued strategic importance was dramatically underscored in 2021, when a massive container ship became lodged diagonally across the waterway for nearly a week, blocking all traffic and disrupting global supply chains. A vivid modern reminder of just how much of the world's commerce still depends on this narrow channel of water first excavated a century and a half earlier. Egypt's rapidly growing population, having roughly tripled since the middle of the 20th century, presents one of the country's most significant ongoing challenges, placing enormous strain on housing, water resources, agricultural land, and public services, particularly in the already densely packed cities of the Nile Valley and Delta, where the vast majority of Egyptians must fit within that same narrow green corridor that has sustained Egyptian civilization since its earliest beginnings. This demographic pressure lies behind the ambitious new administrative capital project east of Cairo, intended not merely to house government offices, but to draw population and development away from the overcrowded historic city. Though such large-scale urban planning projects carry their own considerable risks and uncertainties, and only time will reveal whether the new capital succeeds in meaningfully relieving the pressures facing the old one. Egypt's long tradition of skilled craftsmanship, stretching back to the artisans who decorated royal tombs at Deir el-Medina thousands of years ago, remains genuinely alive today in workshops scattered throughout the country, particularly within the historic quarters of Cairo. Papyrus, the writing material that gave the ancient world one of its most important technological gifts and that lent its name, through Greek and Latin, to the modern English word paper, is still produced today using techniques recreated from ancient methods, with strips of the papyrus plant's pith layered in a crosshatch pattern, pressed and dried to form sheets that can then be painted with scenes drawn from ancient Egyptian art, offering visitors a tangible, if largely tourist-oriented, connection to one of ancient Egypt's most significant contributions to world civilization. Genuine papyrus plants, once so central to Egyptian daily life that they were used for boats, sandals, baskets, and rope in addition to writing material, had actually become quite rare in Egypt by the 20th century, and much of what grows today in cultivated plots specifically for craft production has been reintroduced from populations surviving in other parts of Africa, an odd historical irony in which the plant most associated with ancient Egyptian civilization had to be re-imported to its own homeland. Metalworking traditions, particularly in copper, brass, and silver, remain visible throughout Cairo's markets, where craftsmen still hand-hammer intricate geometric and calligraphic designs into trays, lamps, and decorative items using techniques passed down through generations of apprenticeship, the rhythmic tapping of small hammers against metal forming a familiar backdrop sound in certain quarters of the old city. Similarly, traditional textile weaving, particularly in towns along the Nile Valley known for producing cotton and linen textiles, continues a craft tradition extending back to ancient Egypt's renowned linen production, which was prized throughout the ancient Mediterranean world for its exceptional fineness and quality, used not only for everyday clothing but for the elaborate wrappings that preserved mummies for their journey into eternity. Weekly market days remain a central institution of rural Egyptian economic and social life, with farmers, craftspeople, and traders gathering in designated town squares or open fields to buy, sell, and trade produce, livestock, textiles, and household goods, the atmosphere combining genuine commerce with an equally important social function, as market day often serves as the primary opportunity for residents of scattered rural communities to exchange news, arrange marriages, resolve disputes, and simply socialize with neighbors and relatives from nearby villages. Livestock markets, in particular, remain lively, noisy affairs, with buyers carefully inspecting animals, negotiating prices through practiced haggling, and relying on generations of accumulated agricultural knowledge to assess the health and value of cattle, water buffalo, sheep, and goats, a scene that, in its essential rhythm and social function, would likely be recognizable to Egyptian farmers going back many centuries, even as the specific goods traded and the vehicles used to transport them have changed considerably. Throughout this documentary, we have encountered remarkable women, Hatshepsut ruling as pharaoh, Nefertiti immortalized in one of history's most famous portraits, Cleopatra navigating the treacherous politics of a collapsing Roman Republic. It is worth pausing to consider more broadly the position of women across Egypt's long history, both ancient and modern. Ancient Egyptian women, by the standards of most other ancient civilizations, enjoyed a genuinely notable degree of legal and economic independence. Egyptian women could own property in their own right, initiate divorce proceedings, represent themselves in legal disputes without requiring a male guardian, and engage independently in business and trade, rights that many other ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern societies denied their female populations entirely. Marriage contracts have survived detailing financial arrangements protecting a wife's property in the event of divorce, and legal records show Egyptian women successfully pursuing lawsuits, managing estates, and conducting business transactions with a degree of autonomy that would not become common for women in much of the Western world until many centuries later. This is not to suggest ancient Egypt was some kind of gender-equal utopia. Social and political power remained overwhelmingly concentrated among men, and the small number of women who did rule as pharaoh, like Hatshepsut, generally had to adopt masculine royal iconography and titles to legitimize their unusual position. But the relatively strong legal and economic standing of ordinary Egyptian women, documented across thousands of years of surviving records, represents a genuinely distinctive feature of Egyptian civilization compared to many of its ancient neighbors. The modern history of women's rights in Egypt includes several genuinely significant milestones. Huda Sharawi, a pioneering feminist activist in the early 20th century, famously removed her veil in public in 1923 upon returning from an international feminist conference, an act that became a symbolic landmark in the Egyptian women's movement and helped launch decades of activism around women's education, political participation, and legal rights. Egyptian women gained the right to vote in 1956, relatively early compared to many nations, and Egyptian women have since served in parliament, in ministerial positions, and throughout the professional workforce in medicine, law, academia, engineering, and business. At the same time, contemporary Egyptian women navigate a complex social landscape shaped by the interplay of religious tradition, cultural expectation, economic pressure, and ongoing legal and social reform efforts. Practices and expectations vary considerably across different regions, social classes, and individual families, ranging from highly conservative rural communities to cosmopolitan, professionally ambitious urban households, and Egyptian women themselves hold a genuinely wide range of views regarding tradition, religious observance, dress, and the balance between family and career, reflecting a diversity of perspective that resists easy generalization from outside observers. What remains constant across this diversity is the simple fact that Egyptian women, from ancient queens to modern engineers, have always been central to the story of this civilization, even when the historical record has not always given them the attention their contributions deserve. To understand a country as ancient and layered as Egypt, it helps to step away from the pharaohs and the presidents and simply watch an ordinary day unfold. For the roughly 40% of Egyptians who still live in rural villages, particularly along the Nile Valley and throughout the Delta, life continues to follow rhythms that would be at least partially recognizable to farmers many generations past, even as motorbikes, mobile phones, and satellite dishes have become thoroughly woven into daily existence. Mornings begin early, often before sunrise, especially during the hotter months, when farmers prefer to complete the most demanding fieldwork before the midday heat becomes overwhelming. Fields of wheat, cotton, sugarcane, and vegetables are tended using a combination of traditional techniques passed down through generations and modern irrigation methods, drawing water from the extensive canal network that has replaced the ancient natural floods. Village life remains deeply communal, with extended families often living in close proximity, sharing labor during planting and harvest seasons, and maintaining social bonds through frequent visits, shared meals, and communal celebrations marking births, weddings, and religious holidays. The call to prayer, sounding 5 times daily from the village mosque, structures the rhythm of the day for the Muslim majority, while Coptic Christian communities, concentrated in certain regions of Upper Egypt in particular, maintain their own parallel rhythm of church attendance and religious observance, the two communities generally coexisting in close and often genuinely warm proximity, sharing village life, marketplaces, and often close personal friendships across religious lines. Urban life in Cairo, Alexandria, and Egypt's other major cities presents a markedly different rhythm, though it shares certain underlying continuities with rural tradition. Most urban Egyptians live in apartment buildings, often several generations of an extended family occupying different floors of the same building or living within easy walking distance of one another, maintaining the close family bonds that remain central to Egyptian social life even amid the pressures and pace of city living. Egyptian hospitality is famously generous, and visitors, whether foreign tourists or simply guests from another part of the country, are frequently offered tea, coffee, or food almost immediately upon arriving at someone's home, with refusal sometimes requiring genuine, gentle persistence, since offering hospitality is considered not merely polite, but a matter of personal honor and religious virtue. Egyptians place enormous value on family, and it remains common, even among younger, more urban Egyptians, for children to live with their parents until marriage, and for extended family networks to provide the primary social safety net in times of financial or personal difficulty, filling a role that more individualistic societies often assign to formal institutions. Egyptian celebrations tend to be lively, communal affairs, whether marking a wedding, a birth, or a religious holiday. Weddings, in particular, are often elaborate, multi-day celebrations involving extensive family participation, traditional music and dance, and significant financial investment, reflecting the deep cultural importance placed on marriage as a foundational social institution. During the Islamic holy month of Ramadan, observed by fasting from dawn until sunset, Egyptian cities undergo a dramatic transformation in daily rhythm. Streets that are quiet and subdued during the fasting daylight hours come alive after sunset, when families and friends gather for the iftar meal breaking the day's fast, often followed by extended socializing late into the night, with many businesses, restaurants, and cafes adjusting their operating hours to accommodate this inverted daily schedule. Decorative lanterns, called fanas, traditionally associated with Ramadan, illuminate streets and homes throughout the month, their warm glow becoming one of the most visually distinctive and beloved markers of the Egyptian religious calendar. Beyond individual family gatherings, Ramadan in Egypt is also marked by widespread traditions of charitable giving and communal generosity, with wealthier families, mosques, and businesses commonly setting up tables of mercy, Maidat Rahman, offering free iftar meals to travelers, laborers, and anyone unable to afford a proper meal to break their fast, a practice reflecting the strong emphasis Islamic teaching places on charity and communal responsibility during the holy month. These charitable tables, appearing on street corners and outside mosques throughout Egyptian cities each evening during Ramadan, create a genuinely moving scene as strangers from every social background sit down together at sunset to share a meal, momentarily setting aside the economic and social divisions that otherwise structure much of daily Egyptian life. The end of Ramadan is marked by Eid al-Fitr, a joyous multi-day holiday involving new clothes, special sweets, family visits, and considerable festivity, providing a natural and eagerly anticipated release after a month of daytime fasting. And Egyptian streets during Eid fill with children in new outfits, families visiting relatives, and a general atmosphere of celebration that stands in vivid contrast to the more subdued, contemplative daytime rhythm of the preceding month. Education occupies a place of considerable importance and considerable anxiety in Egyptian family life, viewed by many parents as the single most reliable pathway toward improved economic and social standing for their children. Egypt's education system, one of the oldest and largest in the Arab world, includes free public schooling alongside a substantial private school sector, and the pressure surrounding the Thanawiyya Amma, the national secondary school examination that determines university placement, is genuinely intense, shaping the final years of Egyptian adolescence in ways that many Egyptian adults still recall vividly decades later. Cairo University and Al-Azhar University remain among the most prestigious institutions of higher learning in the country, and Egyptian universities have historically drawn students from across the wider Arab and African world, reinforcing Cairo's long-standing role as an intellectual and cultural capital extending well beyond Egypt's own borders. Work in Egypt spans an enormous range, from small family-run shops and workshops passed down through generations to a large and growing informal economy of street vendors and service providers, to formal employment in government, education, tourism, and an expanding private sector in finance, technology, and manufacturing. Cairo's public transportation network, including its metro system, the first in Africa and the Arab world, opened in 1987, carries millions of passengers daily, and morning and evening rush hours transform stations into scenes of dense, good-natured crowding as commuters navigate a city whose population and infrastructure have grown at very different rates over recent decades. Many Egyptians, particularly in Cairo, work multiple jobs or maintain side businesses to support their families amid economic pressures that have intensified in recent years due to currency fluctuations and inflation, and it remains common for extended families to pool resources, share housing, and support one another financially during difficult periods, reinforcing the deep communal bonds that continue to define Egyptian social life even amid rapid urbanization and economic change. Egyptian cuisine reflects the country's position at the crossroads of Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean, drawing on ingredients and techniques that have been layered, much like Egyptian history itself, over thousands of years of cultural exchange. If there is one dish that could claim to be Egypt's true national breakfast, it is full medames, slow-cooked fava beans, mashed and seasoned with olive oil, lemon juice, garlic, and cumin, often topped with chopped tomatoes, parsley, and a boiled egg, and scooped up with fresh, warm baladi bread, a round, slightly puffy flatbread similar to pita that appears at nearly every Egyptian meal. Full medames has been eaten in Egypt for so long that some food historians believe versions of the dish may trace back to pharaonic times, making it a genuine culinary link between ancient and modern Egyptian life, a breakfast that quite possibly tastes, in its essential form, very much like what farmers along the Nile ate thousands of years ago. Alongside full medames, tamea, Egypt's own distinctive version of falafel, made from ground fava beans rather than the chickpeas more commonly used elsewhere in the Middle East, rounds out the classic Egyptian breakfast. Its bright green interior and crisp golden exterior, a genuinely distinctive regional variation on a dish found, in different forms, across much of the wider Arab world. Street vendors selling full and tamea from carts and small storefronts open at dawn and serve a steady stream of customers throughout the morning, wrapping the food in flatbread with pickled vegetables and tahini sauce for a portable, inexpensive breakfast that fuels much of the country's workforce before the day's labor properly begins. The smell of frying tamea and simmering fava beans, forming one of the most immediately recognizable and beloved sensory signatures of an Egyptian morning. Egypt's other beloved national dish, koshari, tells a different kind of story. one of more recent culinary fusion. Kashari combines rice, lentils, and short pasta, topped with a spiced tomato sauce, crispy fried onions, and often a drizzle of garlicky vinegar and fiery chili sauce called shatta, the whole combination assembled to order at bustling kashari shops found on nearly every street corner in Cairo. The dish is thought to have emerged during the 19th century, likely influenced by Indian and Italian culinary traditions brought to Egypt through trade and colonial-era connections, and it has since become perhaps the single most beloved comfort food in the entire country, a hearty, inexpensive, deeply satisfying meal enjoyed by Egyptians across every social class. Popular koshery establishments, some operating for generations and known by name throughout their neighborhoods, prepare the dish in enormous quantities throughout the day, with cooks working in a practiced, almost choreographed rhythm to assemble bowl after bowl for the steady stream of customers seeking a quick, filling, and remarkably affordable meal. The dish's combination of textures, the softness of the lentils and rice against the slight chew of the pasta, the crunch of the fried onions on top, combined with the customizable heat level offered by the accompanying chili sauce, has made kashari a genuine point of culinary pride, and Egyptians abroad frequently cite it as one of the foods they miss most acutely when living far from home, a humble dish that nonetheless carries an outsized emotional weight tied to memories of family, childhood, and the specific, irreplaceable flavor of home. Molokhia, a thick, dark green soup made from the leaves of the jute mallow plant, finely chopped and cooked with garlic and coriander, often served over rice with chicken or rabbit, is another dish with genuinely ancient roots, its name derived from an Arabic word meaning royal, reportedly because it was once considered fit only for kings. The dish has a distinctive, somewhat mucilaginous texture that surprises many first-time visitors but that Egyptians themselves regard with deep nostalgic affection, often describing it as one of the flavors most powerfully associated with childhood and home. Egyptian meals frequently begin or are accompanied by an array of meze-style small dishes, baba ganoush, made from smoky roasted eggplant, tahini, the rich sesame paste that underpins much of the region's cuisine, and a wide variety of pickled vegetables whose sharp, vinegary flavor provides a refreshing contrast to richer main dishes. Bread is central to virtually every Egyptian meal, and baladi bread, baked fresh daily in countless small neighborhood bakeries, is treated with genuine reverence, considered almost sacred in a culture where memories of historical famine and the enduring, ancient importance of grain remain culturally significant even in times of relative prosperity. No account of Egyptian food would be complete without mentioning tea, which occupies a place in Egyptian social life comparable to coffee's role in many other cultures. Egyptian tea is typically strong, black, and heavily sweetened, often served in small glasses, and offering tea to guests, business associates, or even casual visitors is considered an essential and near-universal act of hospitality, one that occurs dozens of times throughout an ordinary Egyptian day, whether in a private home, a government office, or a small roadside shop. Karkade, a vivid red tea brewed from dried hibiscus flowers, is another beloved Egyptian beverage, traditionally served either hot in winter or chilled over ice during the intense summer heat, its tart, slightly sweet flavor and striking color making it a genuine point of national culinary pride. And on the streets of Cairo and other cities, vendors selling freshly pressed sugarcane juice, extracted on the spot through hand-cranked or motorized presses, offer one of the most refreshing and popular treats available on a hot Egyptian afternoon, its bright green color and intensely sweet flavor providing an immediate, effective antidote to the desert heat. During Ramadan in particular, an array of specific seasonal beverages appears throughout Egyptian cities including Kamar al-Din, a thick, tart apricot drink made from dried apricot sheets dissolved in water, and Ior Ksu, a licorice root drink traditionally sold by vendors carrying large, ornately decorated brass containers on their backs, pouring the dark liquid into small glasses for passers-by breaking their day's fast. their distinctive metal cups clinking together in a rhythmic call that has become one of the recognizable sounds of a Ramadan evening in Egypt. A sensory tradition passed down through generations of street vendors and the customers who have come to associate that particular sound with the holy month's approaching sunset. Egyptian desserts lean heavily toward rich, syrup-soaked pastries that trace their heritage through centuries of Ottoman and broader Middle Eastern culinary exchange, while retaining distinctly Egyptian character in their preparation and presentation. Kunafa, made from fine, shredded pastry strands layered with sweet cheese or cream and soaked in fragrant sugar syrup, appears at celebrations and family gatherings throughout the year, its preparation often a matter of considerable family pride, with recipes and techniques passed down carefully through generations of home cooks. Basbousa, a dense semolina cake soaked in syrup and often studded with almonds, offers a similarly sweet, syrup-forward flavor profile, while during Ramadan specifically, kataif, small stuffed pancakes, either fried or baked, filled with sweet cheese, nuts, or a rich cream, then dipped in syrup, become an essential, eagerly anticipated seasonal treat, appearing on dessert tables and street stalls specifically during the holy month, and largely disappearing again once it ends. Beyond tea, Egyptian coffee, prepared in the Middle Eastern style in a small, long-handled pot called a kanaka, thick, strong, and often flavored with cardamom, holds its own important place in Egyptian social ritual, traditionally served in small cups and consumed slowly, in the company of others, rather than quickly on the go. The traditional Egyptian coffeehouse, or ahwa, remains a genuine institution of daily social life, particularly for men, who gather there to drink coffee or tea, smoke shisha, play backgammon or dominoes, watch football matches, and discuss the events of the day in a manner of unhurried socializing that has remained remarkably consistent across many generations, even as the topics of conversation have shifted from Ottoman politics to modern football rivalries and current events. These coffee houses, some operating from the same modest storefronts for well over a century, function as genuine community anchors, particularly in older, established neighborhoods, offering a space where social bonds are maintained, information is exchanged, and the essential rhythm of daily Egyptian life continues largely unchanged by the passage of time outside their doors. The game of backgammon, called tawla in Egyptian Arabic, occupies a particularly cherished place in coffeehouse culture, played with rapid, practiced movements, and often accompanied by the sharp, satisfying click of dice against wood, matches frequently drawing small crowds of onlookers offering unsolicited commentary and advice to the players, all part of the good-natured social theater that surrounds the game. Shisha, the flavored tobacco smoked through a water pipe, remains hugely popular throughout Egyptian coffeehouse culture despite growing public health awareness campaigns, often shared communally among a group of friends gathered around a single pipe, its sweet, fruity smoke and the slow, unhurried ritual of preparing and tending the coals becoming, for many regular coffeehouse patrons, as much a part of the social experience as the conversation itself. The Egyptian dialect of Arabic, known simply as Egyptian Arabic or Masri, occupies a genuinely unique position within the broader Arabic-speaking world. Thanks largely to Egypt's historic dominance of Arabic language film, music, and television production throughout the 20th century, Egyptian Arabic has become the most widely understood Arabic dialect across the entire Middle East and North Africa, meaning that an Egyptian traveling almost anywhere in the Arab world is likely to be understood, even by speakers whose own regional dialects differ substantially, a linguistic influence disproportionate even to Egypt's considerable size and population. Egyptian Arabic itself carries fascinating traces of the country's deep linguistic history, incorporating loanwords not only from Classical Arabic but also from Coptic, the direct descendant of the ancient Egyptian language, as well as from Turkish, inherited from centuries of Ottoman rule, and from French and English, reflecting more recent periods of European colonial influence and modern global exchange. Modern Standard Arabic, the more formal register used in writing, education, news broadcasting, and religious contexts, exists alongside colloquial Egyptian Arabic in a linguistic arrangement that linguists call diglossia, with most Egyptians moving fluidly between the two registers depending on context. much as many people worldwide shift between formal and casual speech. The overwhelming majority of Egyptians today identify as Sunni Muslim, and Islam permeates Egyptian public and private life in countless visible and subtle ways, from the 5 daily calls to prayer to the widespread practice of beginning conversations, meals, or undertakings with religious invocations, to the significant social and legal weight given to religious holidays and observances. Al-Azhar University in Cairo, mentioned earlier as one of the world's oldest universities, remains one of the most authoritative and influential institutions in all of Sunni Islamic scholarship, its religious rulings and interpretations carrying significant weight for Muslims well beyond Egypt's own borders. Egypt's Coptic Christian community, estimated to comprise somewhere between 6 and 10% of the population depending on the source and methodology used, represents one of the oldest continuous Christian communities anywhere in the world, tracing its origins directly back to the earliest decades of Christianity itself. Coptic Christians maintain distinct liturgical traditions, their own calendar, which notably is based on the ancient Egyptian calendar, and still numbers its years from the beginning of the reign of the Roman Emperor Diocletian, whose persecution of Christians the Coptic Church commemorates as an era of martyrs, and their own rich tradition of iconography, monasticism, and religious music that has been preserved with remarkable continuity across nearly 2,000 years. Relations between Egypt's Muslim majority and Christian minority have, across the long span of Egyptian history, generally been marked by genuine coexistence and mutual social integration, even as periodic tensions and at times serious sectarian violence have also occurred, particularly during periods of broader political instability. Many Egyptians, both Muslim and Christian, take considerable pride in pointing to this long history of coexistence as an essential and defining feature of authentic Egyptian national identity, one that predates and that many hope will continue to outlast the political tensions of any particular era. Beyond mainstream Sunni practice, Egypt maintains a long and vibrant tradition of Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam that emphasizes direct personal experience of the divine through practices including rhythmic chanting, music, and in some orders, ecstatic whirling dance. Sufi orders, called tariqas, maintain devoted followings across Egypt, and their public ceremonies called dhikr, involving communal chanting of the names of God, sometimes accompanied by drums and hand clapping, continuing for hours until participants reach a state of profound spiritual absorption, represent one of the most visually and emotionally striking expressions of Egyptian religious life, one that exists somewhat apart from the more formal, text-centered religious scholarship associated with institutions like Al-Azhar. Closely related to Sufi tradition is the Mawlid, a type of festival celebrating the birthday of a revered saint or holy figure, of which Egypt hosts hundreds throughout the year, ranging from small local celebrations attended by a single neighborhood to enormous multi-day festivals drawing hundreds of thousands of pilgrims, particularly the Mawlid of Sayyid Ahmed al-Badawi in the delta city of Tanta, one of the largest religious gatherings anywhere in Egypt. These Mawlids combine genuine religious devotion with a distinctly festive, carnival-like atmosphere, featuring food stalls, music, entertainment, and an overall sense of communal celebration that some more conservative religious voices have periodically criticized as insufficiently solemn, even as the tradition continues to draw enormous, enthusiastic crowds across the country year after year. Mawlid celebrations traditionally feature their own distinctive sweets, most notably Arousat al-Mawlid, elaborately decorated sugar dolls, historically crafted for girls, and sugar or wooden horses crafted for boys, along with a variety of sesame and nut-based candies sold from festively decorated stalls throughout the festival grounds. These treats, once made almost exclusively from hardened sugar paste in a tradition dating back centuries, have evolved over time to include chocolate and other modern confectionery variations, but the basic tradition of marking these religious festivals with specially prepared sweets, shared among family and given as small gifts to children, remains a beloved and continuous thread connecting modern Egyptian celebration to practices that stretch back many generations, weaving faith, festivity, and the simple pleasure of shared sweetness into a single, enduring cultural tradition. The Coptic Christian tradition of monasticism, mentioned earlier as originating with Saint Anthony in the 3rd century, produced a network of desert monasteries that remain active and, in recent decades, have experienced a genuine revival, with growing numbers of young Egyptian Christians choosing monastic life and older monasteries undergoing significant restoration and expansion. Coptic religious art maintains a distinctive visual style, immediately recognizable through its particular iconographic conventions: large, expressive eyes, flattened perspective, and a color palette that has remained remarkably consistent across many centuries. And Coptic churches throughout Egypt, whether ancient stone structures or modern concrete buildings, typically feature this artistic tradition prominently in their interior decoration, connecting contemporary worshippers visually to nearly 2,000 years of continuous Christian practice in Egypt. For much of the 20th century, Cairo functioned as the undisputed capital of Arabic language culture, its film studios, recording houses, and publishing industry producing content consumed and beloved across the entire Arab-speaking world, from Morocco to Iraq. The most towering figure in 20th century Egyptian, and indeed Arab, music remains the singer Kulthum, whose extraordinarily powerful voice and emotionally intense performances made her, during her decades-long career from the 1920s through her death in 1975, arguably the most famous and beloved singer in the entire Arab world. Kulthum's monthly radio concerts became a genuine cultural phenomenon across the Middle East, with reports, likely only slightly exaggerated, describing streets emptying and even certain regional conflicts pausing so that people could gather around radios to listen to her performances, which frequently stretched for hours as she reworked and extended beloved songs in response to audience reaction. Her funeral in 1975 drew an estimated 4 million mourners into the streets of Cairo, a testament to the almost unparalleled place she held, and to a considerable extent still holds, in the cultural imagination of an entire region. Kulthum did not stand alone atop Egyptian music during this golden era. Mohammed Abdel Wahab, a composer and singer whose career spanned much of the 20th century, is often credited with modernizing Arabic music by incorporating Western instrumentation and orchestral arrangements into traditional Arabic musical structures, creating a distinctive fusion sound that influenced generations of subsequent musicians across the Arab world. Abdel Halim Hafez, known affectionately as the dark-skinned nightingale, became one of the most beloved romantic singers of the mid-20th century. His emotionally vulnerable performances and untimely death in 1977 at just 47 years old, cementing a kind of tragic, enduring stardom that Egyptian audiences continue to celebrate through his recordings and the films in which he starred. Contemporary Egyptian music has diversified considerably, encompassing everything from mainstream pop influenced by broader global trends to the raw, socially observant genre known as mahraganat, or electronic street music, which emerged from working-class Cairo neighborhoods in the early 21st century and has since become enormously popular among Egyptian youth despite periodic controversy and even official disapproval over its unfiltered lyrical content, addressing poverty, drug use, and social frustration. This musical evolution reflects broader generational shifts within Egyptian society, as younger Egyptians navigate their own relationship with tradition, modernity, religious identity, and economic opportunity, often finding in music, as generations before them did through poetry and storytelling, one of their most powerful available means of expressing experiences that formal political and social institutions do not always adequately address. Egyptian cinema, centered in Cairo since the industry's early days in the 1920s and 1930s, similarly dominated Arabic-language film production for much of the 20th century, earning Cairo the nickname Hollywood on the Nile. Egyptian films, musicals, and later television dramas were exported and beloved throughout the Arab world, and Egyptian Arabic's status as the most widely understood dialect owes a considerable debt to generations of Arab audiences who grew up watching Egyptian films and absorbing Egyptian slang and expressions along with the entertainment itself. In literature, Egypt's most celebrated figure is Naguib Mahfouz, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1988. the first and to date only Arabic-language writer to receive the honor. Mahfouz's novels, particularly his celebrated Cairo trilogy, chronicle multiple generations of a Cairo family across the tumultuous decades of the early to mid-20th century, capturing the texture of Egyptian daily life, the tensions between tradition and modernity, and the social and political transformations reshaping the country with a richness and psychological depth that earned him comparisons to great European novelists like Balzac and Dickens. Mahfouz was a lifelong Cairo resident, deeply attached to the city's old quarters and traditional coffee houses, where he could often be found writing and observing the daily life that would populate his fiction. And he survived a serious assassination attempt in 1994 by extremists offended by perceived criticism of religion in his earlier work, an attack that damaged the nerves in his writing hand but did not end his prolific career. The coffeehouse El Fishawi, operating continuously in the Khan el-Khalili market since the late 18th century, remains one of Cairo's most storied literary landmarks, having served for decades as a favored gathering place for Mahfouz and other Egyptian writers and intellectuals. Its ornate mirrors, brass fixtures, and unbroken tradition of round-the-clock operation, the coffeehouse has reportedly never closed its doors, day or night, since it first opened, offering visitors today a tangible connection to the literary and intellectual life that has long characterized Cairo's old city. Egyptian literature since Mahfouz has continued to flourish, producing internationally recognized writers including Ala al-Aswani, whose novel The Yakubian Building, depicting the intersecting lives of residents in a once grand downtown Cairo apartment building, became both a bestseller and a critically acclaimed film, offering a frank, sometimes controversial examination of contemporary Egyptian social issues including corruption, sexuality, and religious extremism. Egyptian storytelling traditions extend back, of course, far beyond modern literature, and elements of ancient Egyptian narrative and folklore have persisted, transformed, through millennia of retelling. Some scholars have traced possible ancient Egyptian influences within the broader tradition of Middle Eastern storytelling that eventually produced works like the tales of 1001 Nights and Egypt's own rich tradition of oral storytelling, proverbs, and folk tales continues to be passed down through families and communities, particularly in rural areas where evening gatherings still sometimes feature elder family members sharing stories much as their own ancestors once did. No account of contemporary Egyptian culture would be complete without mentioning football, which occupies a place in Egyptian public life bordering on genuine national obsession. The rivalry between Cairo's two great clubs, Al Ahly and Zamalek, ranks among the most intense and historically significant football rivalries anywhere in Africa or the Middle East, with matches between the two, known as the Cairo Derby, drawing passionate support that occasionally spills over into broader social and political significance, as it notably did during the tense years surrounding the 2011 revolution, when organized fan groups from both clubs played visible roles in street demonstrations. Egypt's national football team, though it has not always matched the lofty ambitions of its passionate fanbase on the world stage, remains a powerful unifying force across a country otherwise divided along numerous social, religious, and political lines, and few things bring Egyptians of every background together quite so completely as a national team match against a fierce regional rival. Egypt has also produced one of the most celebrated footballers of the modern global game in Mohamed Salah, whose success with Liverpool in the English Premier League has made him not merely a sporting hero but a genuine source of national pride, his image appearing on murals, products, and informal shrines throughout the country, and his charitable contributions to his home village in the Nile Delta, earning him a level of personal affection among ordinary Egyptians that extends well beyond typical sports celebrity. Salah's rise from a modest village background to global football stardom carries particular resonance within Egypt, offering a genuinely inspiring counter-narrative to some of the more difficult economic realities facing many Egyptian families, and his continued visible devotion to his roots, regularly returning to his home village, funding local infrastructure projects including schools, a hospital, and improved roads, has reinforced rather than diminished his standing as, in the eyes of many Egyptians, not just a great player but a genuinely good man who has not forgotten where he came from. Children throughout Egypt, from crowded Cairo neighborhoods to remote Delta villages, can be seen imitating his distinctive goal celebration in impromptu street football matches, a small but telling sign of just how deeply a single athlete's success can embed itself within a nation's broader sense of identity and possibility. The task of preserving, studying, and displaying Egypt's staggering archaeological heritage has occupied scholars and institutions for well over 2 centuries, since the birth of modern Egyptology following Napoleon's expedition and Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphs. The Egyptian Museum in central Cairo, opened in 1902, has for over a century housed one of the largest and most significant collections of ancient Egyptian artifacts anywhere in the world, including, for many decades, the treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb, displayed in famously crowded, somewhat old-fashioned galleries that many visitors found simultaneously overwhelming and charmingly authentic. In recent years, Egypt has undertaken the construction of the Grand Egyptian Museum near the Giza pyramids, one of the largest archaeological museums ever built anywhere in the world, designed to finally display the complete Tutankhamun collection together for the first time since its discovery, along with tens of thousands of other artifacts, many of which had never previously been exhibited to the public due to lack of adequate space. This new museum represents not merely a practical upgrade in facilities but a symbolic statement about Egypt's relationship with its own ancient heritage, asserting Egyptian ownership and stewardship over a civilization that for much of the modern era was studied, excavated, and often displayed primarily by and for foreign institutions and audiences, and reflecting a broader, ongoing conversation about the repatriation of Egyptian artifacts currently held in museums across Europe and North America, including the Rosetta Stone itself, still housed in the British Museum despite periodic formal requests from Egyptian authorities for its return. In April 2021, Egypt staged an extraordinary public spectacle called the Pharaohs' Golden Parade, in which the mummified remains of 22 ancient kings and queens, including Ramesses II and Hatshepsut, were transported in specially designed, climate-controlled vehicles through the streets of Cairo, from the old Egyptian Museum to their new home at the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, accompanied by a lavish televised ceremony featuring music, dancers, and elaborate lighting, watched by millions of Egyptians and broadcast internationally. The event, deliberately staged with considerable pageantry and national pride, offered a striking modern echo of the ancient royal processions these same pharaohs would once have led in life, their mummified bodies now traveling in ceremonial procession through a city that, in its outward modern form, would be almost entirely unrecognizable to them, even as the deep underlying continuity of Egyptian civilization along this same stretch of the Nile remained, in its own way, genuinely unbroken. The mummies themselves continue to reveal new scientific insights even today, as advances in CT scanning and genetic analysis allow researchers to study royal remains without the destructive unwrapping that characterized earlier generations of archaeological investigation, revealing details about ancient diseases, family relationships, causes of death, and even, in some cases, likely physical appearance, adding an ever-deepening layer of scientific understanding to a civilization that, despite over 2 centuries of dedicated Egyptological study, continues to yield new discoveries and new questions with almost every passing year. Let us wander now into the corners of Egypt that surprise even people who believe they know this country well. In the far south of Egypt, particularly around Aswan, live the Nubian people, whose distinct culture, language, and history predate the Arab conquest of Egypt by thousands of years, and whose ancient kingdom, Kush, at times rivaled and even briefly conquered pharaonic Egypt itself, producing its own line of pharaohs who ruled over a unified Egyptian and Nubian realm during what Egyptologists call the 25th dynasty. Modern Nubian villages are instantly recognizable by their distinctive architecture, brightly painted, domed and vaulted mud brick houses in vivid blues, yellows and greens, decorated with geometric patterns and sometimes with painted images referencing the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca or other significant personal and religious milestones. Nubian communities maintain their own distinct language, still spoken alongside Arabic, and their own musical traditions, cuisine and social customs, representing one of Egypt's most vibrant and least internationally recognized cultural minorities, their homeland along the Nile having been significantly disrupted and partially submerged by the construction of the Aswan High Dam, a displacement whose memory remains genuinely painful within Nubian communities even today. Nubian cuisine and music maintain distinctive characteristics that set them apart from the broader Egyptian culinary and musical mainstream, reflecting Nubia's historical position as a cultural crossroads between Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa. Traditional Nubian music often features the simsimia, a small, box-shaped lyre with a bright, percussive tone, along with distinctive vocal styles and rhythms that many musicologists trace to broader East African musical traditions, connecting modern Nubian musicians to a cultural heritage stretching south along the Nile into Sudan and beyond, quite distinct from the Arab-influenced musical traditions dominant in the rest of Egypt. Nubian cuisine similarly draws on ingredients and preparation techniques reflecting this crossroads position, with dishes incorporating okra, dried fish, and distinct spice combinations that differ noticeably from standard Egyptian cooking further north, and Nubian hospitality customs, including elaborate rituals around the preparation and serving of coffee, carry their own specific social meaning distinct from, though related to, broader Egyptian hospitality traditions. In recent decades, growing cultural and political awareness among younger Nubian Egyptians has fueled a modest but genuine revival of interest in Nubian language, music, and heritage, alongside continued advocacy for the right of displaced Nubian communities to eventually return to lands closer to their ancestral homeland along the Nile, an issue that remains a matter of ongoing social and political discussion within Egypt today. Beneath the sands at Saqqara lies one of Egypt's strangest and least visited ancient sites, the Serapeum, a network of underground galleries containing enormous granite sarcophagi, some weighing over 60 tons, that once held the mummified remains of sacred Apis bulls, worshipped as living manifestations of the god Ptah, and given elaborate burials befitting royalty. Walking through these dark, cavernous underground chambers, lined with massive stone boxes each large enough to hold several adult humans, is an eerie experience even for visitors who have grown accustomed to Egypt's more famous tombs and temples. The popular notion of an ancient curse of the pharaohs, supposedly striking down those who disturbed royal tombs, gained enormous international attention following a string of deaths among individuals connected to the excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb in the 1920s, including, most famously, Lord Carnarvon himself, who died from an infected mosquito bite mere months after the tomb's opening. Statistical analysis of the actual survival rates among those present at the tomb's opening shows no meaningful correlation with early death, and most Egyptologists regard the curse as a colorful piece of sensationalized journalism rather than genuine ancient malediction, though some ancient Egyptian tombs did indeed contain inscribed warnings threatening various unpleasant fates upon violators, a genuine ancient practice that likely helped inspire the modern legend. At the ancient granite quarries near Aswan lies one of Egypt's most instructive archaeological sites, an enormous, unfinished obelisk, abandoned partway through its extraction after cracks appeared in the stone, still lying exactly where ancient workers left it, attached on one side to the surrounding bedrock. Had it been completed, this single piece of stone would have stood over 41 meters tall and weighed an estimated 1,200 tons, making it by a considerable margin the largest obelisk ever attempted in ancient Egypt. The unfinished obelisk offers an invaluable, almost accidental window into ancient Egyptian quarrying techniques, clearly showing the marks left by workers using dolerite pounding stones to slowly, painstakingly separate the massive block from the surrounding rock. A laborious process that must have taken many months even before the fatal cracks brought the entire project to a permanent halt. Remarkably, despite the risks so vividly demonstrated by the unfinished obelisk at Aswan, ancient Egyptian engineers did successfully complete, transport, and erect numerous smaller obelisks throughout their history, and in a curious historical twist, more genuine ancient Egyptian obelisks stand today outside Egypt than within it. Roman emperors, deeply fascinated by Egyptian civilization following their conquest of the country, transported numerous obelisks back to Rome as trophies and symbols of imperial power, and several of these ancient Egyptian monuments still stand today in Roman piazzas, having outlasted the empire that took them from their original home. Similarly, obelisks originally erected before Egyptian temples now stand in Paris's Place de la Concorde, London's Victoria Embankment, popularly known as Cleopatra's Needle, despite having no genuine connection to the Queen herself, and New York's Central Park, each one having survived an extraordinary journey across centuries and continents, their hieroglyphic inscriptions, dedicated to pharaohs and gods long forgotten by most passers-by, now presiding quietly over some of the world's busiest modern cities. Far out in Egypt's western desert lies one of the country's most unexpected treasures, Wadi al-Hatan, the Valley of the Whales, a UNESCO World Heritage Site containing the fossilized skeletons of some of the earliest whale species known to science, dating back some 40 million years to an era when this now bone-dry desert lay beneath a shallow tropical sea. These remarkably well-preserved fossils, including specimens that still retain traces of tiny vestigial hind legs, an evolutionary echo of the whale's distant land-dwelling ancestors, provide crucial evidence documenting one of the most dramatic transitions ever recorded in the fossil record, the evolution of whales from land mammals back into fully aquatic creatures. Along Egypt's northern Mediterranean coast, far removed in character from the Red Sea's dramatic coral reefs, lies a stretch of remarkably beautiful beaches with fine white sand and clear turquoise water, particularly around the town of Marsa Matruh. Historically significant as a supply base during the North African campaigns of the Second World War and, in more recent decades, as a favored summer retreat for Egyptian families seeking to escape the intense heat and crowds of Cairo and Alexandria. This coastline experiences a dramatically different rhythm from the Red Sea resorts further south, drawing overwhelmingly domestic Egyptian tourists during the brief but intensely popular summer season, when the coastal towns transform from quiet fishing communities into bustling holiday destinations, only to return to their sleepy off-season character once autumn arrives and the crowds depart. Back in the remote oasis of Siwa, mentioned earlier for its ancient oracle temple, a series of natural salt lakes create an unusual and genuinely restorative bathing experience, their extraordinarily high salt concentration allowing visitors to float effortlessly on the water's surface, much like the more famous Dead Sea, while surrounded by a landscape of palm groves and distant desert dunes entirely unlike anywhere else in Egypt. Local Siwan tradition holds that bathing in these springs, along with the therapeutic desert sand bathing practiced during the hottest summer months, when patients bury themselves in heated sand up to the neck, offers genuine relief for various ailments including arthritis and rheumatism, a folk medical tradition that has drawn visitors to this remote oasis for generations, long before modern tourism infrastructure made the difficult desert crossing considerably more comfortable than it once was. Egypt's deserts, despite their apparent emptiness, support a surprising range of wildlife adapted to extreme conditions, including several species of gazelle, the elusive and endangered Nubian ibex, and various desert foxes, along with an impressive diversity of birdlife that congregates, in particular, along the Nile itself, making the river valley an important stopover point for migratory birds traveling between Europe, Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa. And perhaps the most surprising fact of all, for a country so overwhelmingly identified with its desert landscape, is simply this: despite Egypt's 5,000-year recorded history and one of the largest populations in Africa, the vast majority of the country's entire land area remains, to this day, essentially uninhabited desert, meaning that the true lived Egypt, the crowded villages, the bustling cities, the green fields, the entire sweep of human history we have traveled through tonight, has always existed and continues to exist within a strip of land so narrow that from a satellite orbiting high above, ancient and modern Egypt alike would appear as little more than a single brilliant green thread drawn carefully across an ocean of golden sand. Beneath the waters of Alexandria's modern harbor lies an entire lost district of the ancient city, including portions of the royal quarters where Cleopatra herself once lived, submerged by a combination of earthquakes, tsunamis, and gradual land subsidence over the centuries following the end of ancient Egyptian civilization. Since the 1990s, underwater archaeologists have recovered thousands of artifacts from this sunken city, including colossal statues, sphinxes, and architectural fragments, some so large that specialized floating cranes were required to lift them from the seabed, and ongoing excavations continue to reveal new details about the physical layout of ancient Alexandria at the height of its power, a city that in its prime was arguably the most cosmopolitan and intellectually significant urban center anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world, and whose royal district now rests quietly beneath the waves, visited today primarily by scuba divers and marine archaeologists rather than the philosophers and poets who once walked its streets. Egypt was also home, for many centuries, to a significant and historically important Jewish community, whose presence in the country in fact predates the Arab conquest by well over 1,000 years, with Jewish communities documented living in Egypt since at least the Persian period and likely earlier still. One of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries relating to this community is the Cairo Genisa, an enormous cache of medieval Jewish manuscripts and documents discovered in the storeroom of a Cairo synagogue in the late 19th century, containing an estimated 300,000 fragments spanning religious texts, personal letters, business contracts, and everyday documents dating from roughly the 9th through the 19th centuries. This remarkable archive, now dispersed among libraries and universities worldwide but centered largely at Cambridge University, has transformed historians' understanding of medieval Jewish, and indeed broader Mediterranean social and economic life, offering an unusually intimate window into ordinary lives across nearly 1,000 years, all preserved because Jewish religious tradition forbade the destruction of documents bearing the name of God, leading generations of Cairo's Jewish community to simply store worn-out papers away rather than discard them, inadvertently creating one of history's most valuable accidental archives. The construction of traditional wooden feluccas, the graceful Latin-sailed boats that have plied the Nile for millennia, remains, in a handful of workshops along the river, a living craft tradition passed down through families across many generations, using techniques that would likely be at least somewhat recognizable to boat builders working along this same river thousands of years ago, even as modern tools have gradually supplemented entirely hand-powered methods. Similarly, the camel markets found in various Egyptian towns, particularly the large weekly market at Daraa in Upper Egypt, where camels driven overland from Sudan are traded in scenes of considerable noise and commercial energy, represent a trading tradition stretching back centuries along routes that connected Egypt with the peoples and resources of the African interior long before modern transportation made such overland journeys largely unnecessary for most other purposes. Scattered across Egypt's vast desert expanses are countless smaller, lesser-known sites that rarely appear on standard tourist itineraries, but that offer genuine glimpses into corners of Egyptian history and daily life easily overlooked amid the grandeur of the pyramids and temples. The Red Monastery and White Monastery near Sohag, named for the distinctive color of their exterior stonework, preserve some of the finest and best documented examples of early Christian architecture and painted decoration anywhere in Egypt. Their interiors recently restored to reveal vivid, colorful frescoes that had lain hidden beneath centuries of soot and grime until careful conservation work uncovered them in stunning detail. Along the northern coast, small fishing communities continue traditions of net making, boat maintenance, and seasonal fishing that have sustained Mediterranean coastal life for countless generations, their rhythms dictated by wind, season, and the migratory patterns of fish rather than by any of the great historical narratives that have otherwise shaped this remarkable country. And so, as the night deepens and the world turns quietly on, we leave Egypt behind, for now. A river that has never stopped flowing, a civilization that built monuments meant to outlast time itself, and largely succeeded. A land where pharaohs, gods, saints, and sultans have each, in their turn, left their mark on the same narrow strip of green, pressed always between the same two deserts. There is a phrase Egyptians sometimes use, looking out at their own history: Masr al-dunya wa bataha. Egypt is the mother of the world and its floor, meaning that this land has served in one way or another as a foundation beneath so much of what came after it, quietly supporting civilizations and ideas that would spread far beyond its own borders, long after the pharaohs themselves had been laid to rest. Somewhere tonight, a farmer along the Nile is checking his fields one last time before the light fades completely. The same fields his family has worked for generations, watered by the same river that watered the fields of farmers 5,000 years before him. Somewhere, in a quiet Cairo apartment, a family is finishing a late dinner, the sound of the television low in the background. The day's heat finally beginning to ease as evening settles over the city. Somewhere, in the desert beyond the reach of any city's light, the sand is cooling under a sky filled with more stars than most of us ever see. The same stars that once guided ancient priests as they calculated the coming of the flood. Somewhere along a quiet stretch of the Red Sea coast, a fishing boat is returning to harbor in the last light of evening, its crew tired and unhurried. The day's catch, a small, quiet continuation of a livelihood that has sustained coastal families here for longer than anyone can trace. Perhaps one day you will stand before the pyramids yourself and feel the strange vertigo of touching something built so long ago that it makes your own lifetime feel impossibly small. Perhaps you will drift down the Nile at sunset, the water turning gold, the call to prayer rising softly from a distant minaret. Perhaps you will sit in a small coffee house in old Cairo, a glass of sweet tea in your hands, listening to the unhurried conversation of people who have inherited, without ever quite thinking about it, 5,000 years of continuous human presence along this single generous river. Perhaps you will simply close your eyes, right where you are, and picture that same river, flowing quietly on through the darkness, exactly as it has for longer than anyone can properly measure. But for tonight, let its story carry you gently into rest. The river is still flowing. The desert is still and silent. Somewhere along its banks, a lantern is being lit against the coming dark, just as lanterns have been lit along this same river for more centuries than any single mind can hold at once. The stars above the Nile are the same stars that watched the pyramids rise. And somewhere between the black land and the red land, between the river and the sand, Egypt is, as it has always been, simply continuing, one quiet evening at a time, one generation handing its stories to the next, the way it has done for 50 centuries and counting. Sleep well. The Atlas will be here when you return.